for their hard work. We know a lot of work goes into both this publication, the Annual Energy Outlook, and all of the other great work that is done by the EIA that so many of us in the energy wonkosphere rely on to do our work. And so we're really pleased to be able to host this discussion. I also want to congratulate the administrator, Dr. Linda Capuano, who is not only going to present the outlook this morning, but has also been really innovative in her approach the last few years, where we do a presentation and then we have 2 substantive panel discussions following on, which I think is a great thing. You know, we recently did a podcast on energy outlooks and their value is in starting conversation. It's on having a dialogue around what the future may or may not look like and what some of the constraints and variables are, what the knowns and unknowns are. And so we think this is a really exceptional format for doing that, and sort of congratulate EIA for that idea, as well as coming to a public forum like this to do it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the administrator of the EIA, Linda Capuano. She's going to give a presentation of the outlook. Then we'll take some questions, and then we'll start on this first of 2 panel discussions about some of the uncertainties in the demand outlook for 2050. And then second, we'll have a panel discussion on some of the trade trends. So looking forward to a really great discussion. Thank you very much, Linda, for being here.
Let me make sure it's awake. There we go. Okay. So thank you and welcome to the public release of the U.S. Energy Information Administration's Annual International Energy Outlook 2019. I'd like to start by thanking CSIS for hosting us and structuring the panels. It's a lot of work in the background. This IO is a modeled projection of the global energy system from now until 2050, and is one of 2 long-term energy projections published to fulfill EIA's Department of Energy Organization Act of 1977 requirement that the EIA provide annual reports on trends and projections for energy use and supply. But to be clear, the IEO is not a prediction. All the cases being released today assume current laws and regulations are generally unchanged to 2050. This assumption enables the reference case to be used as a baseline when considering the impact of potential future policy actions. The IEO report, which includes these presentation graphics and the data, will be released today on the EIA website. This is an exciting time to be modeling energy. There is a great deal of change. Energy consumption continues to grow globally, with increases in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And changing end-use demographics has implications for global energy resource production and trade. Consumers are using more electricity, and there are diverse ways to generate electricity. Modeling the impact of these global energy changes is as important as ever in 2019 IEO. This year's IEO includes a reference case and 4 side cases with differing input assumptions to address the range of uncertainties in making long-term energy projections. To model the impact of economic growth on energy consumption, EIA adjusted the assumptions around regional growth factors. For example, using 3% compound annual growth rate for the global gross domestic product, GDP, in the reference case, and 3.7 and 2.7% in the high and low economic growth cases, respectively. Similarly, to examine the uncertainty in world energy prices, EIA altered oil demand and supply assumptions to achieve $100 per barrel for the reference case and $185 and $45 per barrel for the high and low oil price cases. Next, before getting into the details, let's look at 5 important insights from this year's IEO. First, manufacturing centers are shifting towards Africa and South Asia, especially India, resulting in energy consumption growth. Second, natural gas and petroleum product consumption is rising in Asia faster than supply is growing, potentially shifting trade patterns and infrastructure investments. Third, end-use consumption is increasingly shifting towards electricity, and in addition, falling costs, demand growth, and policy will work together to shift the electricity generation mix. And finally, in the late 40s, renewables are projected to displace petroleum as the most used energy source. Now let's look into the IEO 2019 modeling results. This graph shows world energy consumption rises nearly 50% to 910 quadrillion BTUs or quads by 2050. Much of this is driven by the growth in non-OECD countries, as shown in the next graph. This graph compares the projected GDP growth details between 2018 and 2050 for the reference case. While OECD economies average about 1.5% GDP growth, shown in black on the left, economic growth is strongest in developing non-OECD countries in red on the right. India, Africa, China, and other Asian countries average growth rates of nearly 4% or higher. In addition, in 2018, non-OECD economies were home to about 2/3 of the world's population. This growth impacts energy consumption, as shown on this next graph. Looking at the red line, the IEO reference case projects that energy consumption growth in non-OECD economies will average about 1.6% through 2050, while the OECD economies in the blue line will, with less unmet energy demand, have a projected average of about 0.4% annually. This graph shows more energy consumption details. In non-OECD economies, strong economic growth, increased access to energy, and rapid population growth lead to rising energy consumption, with nearly 70% growth by 2050. More than half of the projected growth increase comes from Asia in red, while the Middle East increases about 55% and Africa consumption doubles. In contrast, OECD energy consumption in dark blue remains relatively flat, increasing 15% by 2050. So, EIA's global projections of future energy consumption are heavily influenced by India, China, Africa, and other non-OECD Asia, but there is a lot of uncertainty in the nature of this growth. How energy efficient will it be? How much energy will be in industries? How much air conditioning will be used, and how many cars will be driven. Looking in more detail, this graph on the left projects that the industrial sector continues to be the largest consumer of energy globally, with the graph on the right showing about half of the industrial energy is consumed in energy-intensive manufacturing, the light green bar. But while China remains the world's largest single industrial energy consumer, growth is steadily moving to non-OECD Asia and India. Collectively, non-OECD countries consume more energy in the industrial sector, and their energy consumption growth is about twice the rate of the OECD countries. Let's look at the big news in fuel mix on the left. Driven by economics and policy, global renewable energy consumption increases by 3% per year, the green line on the left, while electricity use grows faster than any other end-use fuel, the yellow line on the right. As a result, the reference case projects that by 2050, renewables displace petroleum as the most used energy source globally. However, global energy consumption continues to outpace renewable growth, and while their shares decline, fossil fuel consumption, including coal, are projected to increase to meet demand. The left graph shows petroleum and other liquid shares decline from 32% to 27%. Natural gas is the world's fastest growing fossil fuel, increasing by 1.1% per year. And coal use is initially projected to decline as regions replace coal with natural gas and renewables in electricity generation, but then it begins to increase in the 40s to meet industrial and electric power generation demands in non-OECD Asia, excluding China, and averages about 0.4% per year growth to 2050. So oil consumption does not peak despite the tremendous growth in electricity use, which shows more growth in the residential sector when compared to industrial, commercial, and with growth in electric vehicles, which are projected to reach over 400 million vehicles in 2050. Looking at transportation in more detail, the graph on the left shows that OECD world consumption of energy for transportation declines by 1%, while on the right, non-OECD grows close to 77% by 2050. The declining transportation demand drives a decline in OECD liquid fuel consumption, as shown on the left graph, while the graph on the right projects that non-OECD liquid fuel consumption will nearly double as economies and populations grow. Growth in non-OECD Asia is projected to account for about 3/4 of the global increase in liquid fuels consumption, with India experiencing rapid industrial growth and increased demand by motorized transportation. While petroleum production demand is growing in Asia, these graphs show that global crude oil production grows nearly 30%, led by production increases in non-OECD countries in the Middle East, Europe, mainly Russia, and Americas, mainly Brazil. Or should I say notably Brazil. OECD Americas include the US and Canada, also shows considerable growth as hydraulic fracturing of tight resources drives production growth in the US, and oil sands development drives production growth in Canada. The mismatch between petroleum demand and supply centers is projected to increase refinery throughput in Asia to satisfy local demand for petroleum products, and in general, the IEO projects that global refinery throughput will increase. Asia is projected to grow 60% by 2050 as economies grow and expanding middle class demands more consumer goods and fuel. Looking at natural gas demand, these graphs show that non-OECD on the right outpaces OECD and grows 70%. EIA projects that industrial activity, natural gas-fired power generation, and LNG fuel transportation all contribute an increase in natural gas consumption of more than 40% by 2050. These graphs show where natural gas production grows to meet growing demand. Natural gas production growth is led by OECD Americas, the Middle East, and non-OECD Europe and Eurasia. The United States remains the world's largest natural gas producer, while Canada also continues to produce relatively high volumes. And this graph shows that the geographic mismatch between natural gas demand and supply results in significant growth in natural gas trade. EIA projects that global natural gas exports by pipeline and LNG by tanker will more than double by 2050. Both pipeline and LNG export infrastructure are projected to expand significantly, and pipeline flows continue to account for most interregional trade. Asia will surpass Europe as the largest net natural gas importer as demand grows, and non-OECD Europe and Eurasia, mostly in Russia, continue to export the most natural gas, and the Middle East will surpass the Americas in 2040s in terms of natural gas exports. Finally, what does this mean to emissions? Despite a less carbon-intensive fuel mix, growth in energy consumption results in a continuing rise in global energy-related CO2 emissions at an average rate of less than 1% per year between 2018 and 2050. In the near term, energy-related CO2 emissions growth is slowed by increases in energy efficiency and a gradual shift from coal towards natural gas and renewable energy resources. In the longer term, broad population and economic growth increases global energy consumption that leads to increasing emissions. Note that in OECD countries, even with gradual expansion of their economies, the projected energy-related CO2 emissions decline slightly through 2050 and are 14% lower than 2005. However, global coal-related CO2 emissions are projected to increase slowly. Coal use generally declines in OECD regions and China, but accelerates after 2040 in India and other parts of non-OECD Asia. And remember, our reference case generally has current policies and regulations, and as a result, this can change if there are policy changes, which we do not show in our reference case. EIA does not project or guess at potential policy changes. There are others that do that. So there is still opportunity to reduce this further with energy efficiencies, new technologies, and additional policies. And so this occurs despite, as I showed before, this is a repeat slide, of the rapid increase in renewables and electricity. And with that, I will conclude my comments on the EIA IEO 2019, and I'll thank you for your attention, and we'll move into the Q&A. And as is our practice, We have brought many of the EIA experts here to answer your questions so that they can give you a broader or more detailed response to your areas of interest. I think we have something like 15 people here, and I'll introduce Angelina LaRose, who's the director of the Office of Integrated and International Energy Analysis, and she will direct the questions towards the EIA expert. Thank you, Angelina.
Okay, great. Thanks, Linda. That was really great. There was a lot there that we went through relatively quickly, so I'm glad we have a good amount of time to sort of unpack some of it. Maybe what I'll do is I'll start with a couple questions, and then we'll move to the audience. I think two things that I noted, and again, want to make sure we get the sort of full background of what you cited in some of the projections. The first one was on your comments around peak oil demand, right? So that's obviously been something that is of interest to both sort of the markets and policymakers. You say that it's not, in your projections, you don't have oil demand peaking out to 2050. Yeah, Can you explain again, unpack why that is?
So as I showed in the early graphs, we see a combination of economic growth, a combination of population growth, and the desire for new products, additional products, oil-based products, air conditioning, other transportation is shifting, that even though you see a very aggressive change in renewables uptake, it is just not growing fast enough to meet the demand, and we don't see demand tapering off. And like I say, that's an area of a lot of debate and conversation. I think that's also would be a good conversation to have with some of the panels that we have.
Sure, excellent. Did you guys want to add anything to that?
Well, I think that's a great initial response. It lays out the major factors. You can see that in the OECD, much of the petroleum consumption is essentially leveled off. We have gone so far as to globalize a lot of the fuel economy in the way that we project transportation. So for light-duty vehicles, much of the platforming of technology is kind of consistent between regions these days, but there's just a lot more growth in the vehicle stock. So there's a heavy competition in the model between electric vehicles, natural gas, and what we would consider gasoline-powered vehicles, including hybrids. And right now, the gasoline-powered vehicles are still playing a pretty strong role. But I have to say that a lot of that growth and continued growth in the non-OECD is diesel and is jet fuel. There's a lot of transportation for freight, and there is a lot of passenger air travel going on in the projections due to economic growth.
So that was Jim Turner here from EIA. I'll just add another comment is that, again, policies. One thing we did discuss at last year's IEO was the uncertainty around the growth of GDP and energy usage in the emerging economies. And as I pointed out when we did our presentation last year, when you look at the expectation of efficiency, if it is going to be that good, which could be driven by regulations, it could be driven by technologies and consumer behavior, there could be a case for having the energy consumption rolling off, but we just have not seen it in our numbers.
Great. Maybe a couple other questions. You also had a slide showing coal demand increasing towards the end of the projection period, and I think you attributed that growth to China and other non-OECD Asia. Can you unpack that a little bit about why that is particularly the case, given the fact that some of those very large countries actually do have policies in place to peak the use?
Turn that over to.
Yes, I'm Thad Hudeman. I run the electricity analysis team for EIA. So that's definitely probably our most frequently asked question. How does coal stay up? Obviously, we're all following very closely the developments in China and India in particular. Our analysis is based on what we regard as an exhaustive review of the available information. Let's start with China, for example. For China, one of the things that was most impressive to us is that there have been an increasing number of reports that have showed power plants that China had announced, coal-fired power plants that it had initially announced that it had either deferred or canceled, that were showing continuing construction. in China. That's backed up as well by, we found that the Chinese national government in 2014 devolved permitting authority for new coal projects to regional and local authorities with the, obviously the added incentive for the folks in regional and local level to continue development that is advantageous to local economies. So we were impressed with that evidence showing that China was, even though it obviously has a very strong stated policy of peaking coal capacity in the next decade or so, that we thought that process was probably delayed and would result in a higher level of coal capacity in that time frame. In India, we looked at you'll see India is the fastest growing, I believe the fastest growing economy. Somebody back me up on that. With the substantial growth there, basically all forms of electric generation grow in India, with the emphasis in our case, for at least the next decade or so, coal being very important to India as well, coal being a domestic resource that provides a significant amount of coal transportation, subsidizes passenger rail transportation in India, et cetera. So the much faster growth for us meant that coal in India went on a kind of a faster growth path, but we would note all forms of electricity are growing. So is that lengthy enough?
No, that was great. So maybe one follow-up to that, and then one final question, and then I want to take questions from the audience. So be thinking of what you want to ask. So just to be clear on the stated policy parameters of modeling, you just said there is a clearly stated policy in China, but you don't think they're following through on it, so you didn't model it? And are there other policies?
Let me try to say this at top level. So we pay close attention to stated policies unless we see data that indicates otherwise. If there is no data, we do not speculate. We don't try to guess what another country is going to do. But for example, we have a lot of observation of trade flows. We get a lot of observation of what's going on. And so if we see a difference between the stated policy and what's going on in reality, we will gently move things. Okay, and we do issues and focus on it. We're transparent. We're a transparent organization. If we do something like that, it's discussed. It's discussed in workshops. We are not a policy organization, so this is really a discussion.
Sure.
So if people are interested, we can point you to the data that we have, and when an issues and focus comes out or a tie comes out, we will send you the link. So Tad is the guy.
Great. So the other places where you may have done that sort of data-based amending of a policy objective, it's outlined in the IEO.
I would go a little less as saying it's outlined in the IEO, but it's definitely referred to, but not in great detail. I don't believe. I'm looking at Angelina. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, that's correct.
And we'll put issues and focus on it out issues and focus articles on it because we want people to know this again because we want that debate to happen. It's really important for others to know that we're seeing something, we have an opinion, so that that others can adjust their comments around that. You don't have to believe what we say, but at least we point you in the right direction so you can think about it.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Okay. And final question on my side is you say that there's sort of a high and low economic case. Are any of your major conclusions from the base case adjusted relative to the high and low economic growth cases?
Yes. So, for example, CO2 consumption varies, but I don't. Obviously I don't have the number at the top of my head, but for example, since energy consumption is very much based on economic growth, a GDP range for the high and low case. And so that obviously affects the amount of energy consumed, and it'll affect the amount of CO2 emissions. So they do flow through the model. So they are distinct cases. It's not that we change one variable. That variable affects other variables.
Okay. Did you guys want to add anything?
Do you have anything specific that you might want to call out?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Sendich, the macroeconomic analysis team at Energy Information Administration. So we develop these cases offline, and we don't actually change GDP. What we do is we change the components of GDP to target an overall growth rate. So it's not something that we change at the headline level. We do in fact deal with the individual detail of the composition of each of these economies, primarily targeting consumers, so that would be the personal consumption expenditure that you see in the expenditure accounts, and the investment component of expenditure within the economy.
Great, thank you. Okay, now for your questions. We'll start right here with Jan. If you could just wait for the mic, state your name and affiliation, and question in the form of a question.
I'm Jan Maris with Resources for the Future. My recollection of your slides where you said the industrial demand is the largest demand for energy in the world. What's puzzling me is I think, at least now in the United States, it's about a quarter, transportation, transportation, electricity, and industry. And I am frankly very surprised that on the global basis, it is so much larger than all the rest. Is there a simple explanation?
So I'll do it at a top level, and then let Jim go in more detail, which is, the U.S. in a more matured economy is shifting to more services, and our population growth is slower, and the demand for goods is still high, but does not compare to emerging economies where we have both increase in GDP, increasing in spending, and population growth, so that we see that difference. Jim, do you want to give more detail?
Yeah, Jim Turner, Director of Energy Consumption and Efficiency Analysis with EIA. It is the case that many countries in the non-OECD in particular kind of lead with industrial energy consumption. Keep in mind these charts are really of energy, so it's even more magnified than just a chart of simple economic activity would be. Furthermore, many of our end-use consumption charts take out the influence of primary energy consumption versus delivered energy consumption. So the upstream electricity transformations and so forth on a primary chart would make the residential a little larger versus the industrial. So at the end-use level, a lot of the end-use industrial is direct burn by the industrial sector itself, not electricity. So there's a couple of magnifications relative to just say a pie chart of economic activity, but the industrial sector really is a huge driver in non-OECD, although that will diminish over time.
We've got one question here, and then we'll go over there.
Hi, Chris Knight with Argus Media. So in your 2017 World Outlook, you had renewables at 146 quads, and now it's up to 252. Just wondering where all that extra renewables came from.
Policy changes, costs are coming down. People, it's converting. I don't know, is there more you want to say about it? Tad?
Yeah.
Tad, excuse me.
This is Chris Domovich from Team Lead for Renewable Electricity Analysis. I think that's about right. It's the biggest difference is in the modeling side, we actually developed a new model for electricity. Before, our model basically traded off between gas and coal and oil, and renewables was an exogenous input based on policies, so the most renewables you could ever get was what was specified by policy. The policies have gone up since 2017, and we continue to model them, but now the model also includes the economics of renewables, and during that time, during the last 5-10 years, especially solar and wind have come down quite a bit, and so they get built for economic reasons as well as policy reasons in quite a number of regions, especially regions that have a lot of growth in electricity demand.
So this is really an important point, because I mentioned that the reference case is a current policy case, and it's not while it's a projection of trends, it's not a prediction. And so a difference between 2017 and now should be looked upon as a success in investments in technology, policy changes that are driving renewables. So like I said, the going out to 2050, our reference case still has current policies which roll off, and so there's opportunity for that to continue to change and drive more renewables.
Can I just ask one follow-up question to that? Because I think it's probably the most popular question we get here when we do outlooks of any sort, which is the sort of sophistication of renewable energy and electricity models. And so it's great to know that you guys have an updated one and that yielded a lot of insights. Are there constraints on it still? And I think, again, because one of the most popular questions we have is what are the constraints in the way that these models think about the future of renewables, whether it's incorporating them to the electric power system, or so I think there will be a lot of interest in figuring out what you think the constraints still are.
So our, this is a new model and we're building it up. It's not as sophisticated as our domestic model, which has very well-defined, well-developed constraints that reflect the interactions. We do, because we have that experience, we're able to incorporate some of them now, some of them we're still working on. It's a work in progress. We don't have energy storage, for example, is a big potential player when you get a lot of renewables, intermittent renewables, and that's not yet in the IEO model, but we're working on putting that in. But there's just a lack of information globally about how particular demand. A lot of it's dependent on how the particular time of day and seasonal demands correlate with solar and wind patterns. We don't have a lot of international information on either of those things. Well, the sunlight you can pretty much figure out just from how the Earth moves around the sun, but the wind and the load, how those interact. We're lacking information to the extent that we know that our model is capable of accounting for
So
that.
let's answer it two ways. So that the model has its limitations based on available data and the assumptions and the set of calculations that go into it. But when we construct the interplay, we let the renewables grow as fast as it's capable of growing, and then use the other fuels to meet the demand beyond what renewables can meet. So we give renewables the most opportunistic chance to, again, it's an economic model, to economically grab as much market share as it can.
Great, thank you. There's a question over here on the side.
Just one follow-up.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Michelle Bowman with EIA. I'm the project manager for the new International Electricity Market Model. And just giving some more specifics to what Chris said, you're asking about specific constraints on renewables growth. So we have some constraints in there that limit how much generation can be met by variable renewable energy in any given time slice. So that's a specific number that a lot of education and guessing went into. We also have constraints about transmission growth. So we do let the model build new transmission at a cost, and we have a very well-defined supply curve for that. And we also have the constraints on how much the capital costs can decrease over time, and a lot of that, so learning by doing. And a lot of that is informed by our AEO. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to plug an Issues in Focus we're doing, exploring different learning by doing decreases in cost, which is exploring different high and low renewable cost cases. That'll be coming out in the next couple months.
Excellent, thank you.
One thing, for those of you who are interested in modeling, as you've learned, we have a new international electricity market model. We also have this IO represents the first time we have our global hydrocarbon supply module also used to help generate our projections. We have write-ups on both these modules on our main IEO page if you're interested, and we're also going to be releasing the full documentation like we normally do with our models.
Great, thank you. Okay, we go over there and then into the middle.
Hi, I'm just curious if we can go back to the slide that showed the different sector uses for energy that include the outsized industry use.
Oh, thanks. What are sector uses?
Yes.
Wait, and what was the question again? Can you repeat it?
It was just. This is a follow-up. Sorry, this is a follow-up on the question a couple back about just how large industrial energy use is, specifically for non-OECD countries. I thought it'd be helpful to have the visual matched with it.
Oh, you just wanted the visual?
Yes,
okay.
thank you.
There you go. Asking you shall receive. There you go. Adam, there you go. Oh,
Hi.
yeah.
So I'm on the industrial team at EIA. There's a slide in our flip book that really illustrates this a little more clearly. So on the right it has the same graph, but on the left it just shows through GDP expenditure where the stuff in industrial lines up, and it's striking because energy-intensive manufacturing represents a small portion of GDP, but a huge portion of overall energy consumption. So trying to understand, like the last guy's question was, why the energy distribution for industrial is different in the U.S. versus in emerging economies, and it's because those emerging economies are much more invested in heavy industry than a more a more mature economy like the American OECD group.
Adam Siegel, Insight Through Analysis. I'm going to, from the flip book, there's, in fact, 94 people can't see this, but it's, although renewables are cost competitive compared with new fossil fuel fired electric generating capacity, displacing existing non-renewable capacity requires policy incentives. Already in the majority of the world, renewables beat new. In increasing every day in bids, renewables are beating existing plants in price. The cost declines in renewables remain dramatic, while there's basically no learning curve going on in fossil fuel plants. I'm not understanding why in a 30-year forecast there seems to be an assumption that renewables will not be cost competitive against existing.
Okay, so first, there is not an assumption that renewables will not be cost competitive. The model is a calculator. You put in the assumptions, and that includes technology improvements, or as you say, learning curves. It puts in policy, and then the NEMS model calculates out the results. So that is the result. I don't know how to say it any more eloquently or simply. There are many groups out there, including that do the NEMS model. EIA does to go into the bowels of the actual mathematical calculations would be required to answer your question in great detail. But it does not assume anything about the end state of renewables. It builds the end state of renewables from assumptions. Pardon? Sure, go ahead, rephrase it, yeah.
So a different way is the forecast in this, 94 page, this page 94, we're not going to have many serious senior policymakers reading through all these pages. But the statement there, in essence, leaves one with an assumption that renewables are not cost competitive against existing, because it says it is cost competitive against new. But to deal with existing requires policy, and increasingly, utility decision makers are looking at bids, and they're making decisions about when are we going to retire plants early,
right?
Because the renewables are so much more cost effective.
Okay, so
and that nuance disappears.
Yeah, so I think, Chris, I don't think this is an argument about the calculation. It's the way it's phrased on the page. Yeah, so it's so we'll go back and look at that, but I think that's the point is you're taking the communication as a limitation assumption, which I don't believe, which is not the case. So we'll go back and look at how we're saying it.
Yeah, certainly it's, as Linda pointed out, it's not the assumption that they will or will not be competitive one way or the other. It's a result that, and there are certainly cases in both the model and the real world where you have renewables that are able to displace some expensive existing generation off the margin, but it's simple math that if you're competing against the entire cost of building and operating a new plant, that's an easier competition than displacing existing, and most of the growth that we see in renewables that is not policy-based is in areas that have a lot of growth. The growth in areas where load growth is a lot less, those areas all have strong policies, so it's a little bit harder to disentangle what's policy and what's economic, but generally we see that to get a lot of of growth. It's hard to do when you have.
But again, Chris, it's how we phrase it on the page, so we'll go back and make sure that we're communicating better.
Great. Okay, additional questions? Oh, wow, okay. Let's go right here in the middle, and then we'll come back over here.
Thanks, Tom Tiernan with the Foster Report. I believe one of the staffers, I want to make sure I heard it correct, that energy storage technologies are not included in the projections, or any projection on when that might happen, and if so, because it's energy, if that would be its own category, because it stores power from renewables or gas or fossil or whatever.
So let's distinguish between the AO and the IO, just so you know. So at the national level, we do include storage, but on the global level.
Right, so in our annual energy outlook, our domestic outlook, we do include energy storage both as existing and to build new energy storage, and that is something that sort of as we speak is being developed for the international model. My expectation is that it should be in by the next IEO, right? Yeah, so we're already testing that, but it was not, going to happen for this IEO.
Gentleman right there.
Good morning. My name is Steve Meyer. I'm an independent consultant. An easy question for you. You provided an oil price on which the forecast is based. There's probably several natural gas prices on which the forecast is based. What are those prices?
Good morning. I'm John Staub. I lead petroleum, natural gas, and biofuels analysis. So oil prices are an input to the model. They are used to shape our understanding of what the production costs are for oil and gas. Natural gas prices are not an input into the model. They are related through supply curves, but similar to how we produce the annual energy outlook, oil prices are an input, gas prices are a result from the interactions within the system. They're a function of electricity demand, industrial demand, production of gas resources, it's the integrated economy.
Okay, and then we'll take one there.
Hi, Maya Weber with S&P Global Platts. With the increase of natural gas for electricity consumption, could you address whether you would be looking at, when you project emissions, whether you're looking at CO2 equivalents to take into account methane, or whether EIA will just continue looking at carbon emissions?
Yes, so the published emissions, and what Linda showed earlier, is our energy-related CO2 emissions. We do not publish methane or other emissions, if that's your question. So we do not take the whole calculation, whole picture of.
So, I mean, that's the administrative question. It's a resource limitation. We do energy-related calculations on emissions, and but our primary, so shall I start from the beginning? Our primary responsibility is to look at consumption and production, and CO2-related emissions are a byproduct of that, and so we do gather that data and calculate it, and we go as far as our budget allows in collecting data, or as far as the data is reliable enough to collect, and when I say reliable, it means can meet statistical quality standards for samples, showing that it's representative. So there's a whole complicated series of things that we need to do when we collect data. So it was not intentional. It's just am I answering the right question?
I think you're absolutely right. It is a historical data issue, and that's one of the largest.
We would like to do it all, so that would be our intent, but we have to use judgment in terms of applying our resources to all the products that we release and to all the data that we collect.
Okay, we've got time for one additional question. I have one from Twitter, if no live people. Oh, there you go. And I'll add the Twitter one in after.
Hi, I'm Joniel Cha with S&P Global Platts. Would one of you be able to comment on uranium supply and demand forecast? And the World Nuclear Association released a report early September basically showing shortages of uranium supply for the nuclear industry, and I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Right behind you.
Oh. Hi, I'm Slade Johnson with the Office of Coal and Uranium Analysis. We actually don't really look at world uranium, but I can get back to you. We definitely do look at domestic uranium. Give you my email, my card. All right.
Did you want to add to that?
No, thanks.
Okay, and maybe one final question we have from Twitter. It's a little bit of a riff on the one we did before, but it says, if the analysis is based in general on current policies and laws, which one did they assume will change and how? So I think that there is an interest in sort of, as there is in every sort of reference case scenario, are there like fundamental changes in assumptions, or is there at least a guideline, you know, like stated policy might not be a pronouncement, but something enacted in law, or like what, just some general parameters for people to understand how that works.
Hi, Jim Turner again, Energy Consumption and Efficiency Analysis. I really think that enforcement provisions are the key determinant of our kind of view of policy. So it really does have to do with whether or not there's been some kind of a discussion about, you know, timetables, you know, who's in charge of it, who do you have to demonstrate it to for compliance. That's probably the most important type of policy parameter that we'd look at. But we catalog policies as best we can, region to region throughout the world, and you know, a top-level national policy is definitely something we take note of. But underneath that somewhere is a compliance track, and really for us it's probably more about timeframes.
So let me make a comment to make sure there's no confusion here. So we have two reports. I'm going to just clarify some things. We have two annual reports, our Annual Energy Outlook, which is the United States. In the United States Annual Energy Outlook, we use current policy and regulations. We don't generalize, so that's absolute. Okay, now we're talking about international. International, as you can imagine, and also by the number of questions we're getting, is very difficult to collect data. It's very difficult to be precise. We are challenged just like other organizations that do international. And so when we say generally, we intend, and again, our principles are we attempt in every way to use the policy unless we see data that states otherwise. Now you're asking a very specific question. Is there a precise list? Because you want that precise list. I would say that there are conversations in some of our reports that explain where things are fuzzy. And certainly we will be calling attention to that. But sorry, like many things, there isn't a precise list.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Well, listen, we've reached the first sort of hour block of our conversation today. I want to say a big thank you to Linda and to her team for presenting the outlook, and ask my sort of colleague Guy Caruso in the first panel to come up for our first conversation. So thank you, and congratulations again on finishing the IEO.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank Linda and her outstanding team from EIA for all their hard work. I know the IEO is a difficult product, and we heard some of the reasons why in the Q&A about coming up with data from some of these countries, the non-OECD Asia, which is the leading source of growth, is also the most difficult place to get data, and especially to do the kind of modeling that the EIA is now developing. And but it's always been one of my favorites because of my international background, and I enjoyed working with the team every year that the IEO was published. And I believe this is the first IEO since Linda Doman's passing. And Linda was, I know you're not supposed to have favorites when you're leading a large organization, but Linda was one of my favorites. And she passed away earlier this year, and always enjoyed working with her on the IEO. So I think of this as maybe nostalgic in remembering Linda, and I know all of your former colleagues do too. But the other thing is you always wind up getting compared. EIA, when you're publishing something like this, you always get questions that I'm surprised we didn't get one this morning about how do you compare with the IEA's World Energy Outlook? How do you compare it with BP? And it's so difficult to do because of the assumptions are different. The model structure is clearly different. But nevertheless, it's probably when the energy journalists write about the IEO tomorrow or today, I'm sure you'll see some stories that say, oh, the IEA is more optimistic or more pessimistic about some form of supply-demand balance. And to try to add some depth to that question, and to get, we have 3 speakers on this panel that are going to delve into issues that have more focused on energy demand, and we're extremely fortunate to have 3 outstanding speakers who know the subject very well from different perspectives. And when another question, so someone who's been around as long as I have gets is, well, how come you got it wrong, and what was the reasons why are the reasons you got it wrong? And I think we've heard some of them already. Policy change is very difficult to capture policy, and especially when you're looking at it in a global perspective like this, and it's very difficult to be very good at assuming, what is China going to do in 2035, and that's part of the what we're going to hear from Kevin Book, on the policy side. Another one is, how do you model things like technology change and other issues that go into the modeling? I'm sure into the new EIA model have grappled with these, and we're going to hear from 2 other speakers, Gregor Peshko and Mac Lawrence, about those issues. So without going more detail into their biographies, because you have them before you, I'll turn the floor over to Kevin, who we're fortunate here at CSIS to also have Kevin as a resident associate, in addition to his day job as managing director of Clearview. Kevin, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Guy. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for EIA for all you do. I suppose I should say, sort of, ladies, gentlemen, analysts, administrators, because it's quite an audience full of people who have something to say and who know a lot. So it's very much a pleasure to be here today. Unfortunately, I've been given the topic of policy uncertainty, which is it's very much the skunk at the picnic when it comes to modeling things. So in my very best Pepe Le Pew, I will be bringing you a skunk army on July 4th for the next 10 minutes. Let me say that the first slide I've got is not, whoops, that's not the first slide. Incompetence with there we go. The first slide says I can't be trusted and don't listen. But the second slide is really addresses the questions about whether it's economics or policy you're talking about. What is a policy, right? So policy, my personal policy, your company's policy, our government's policy, is a deliberate choice. Deliberate choices have processes. Those processes can be abstruse or very transparent. Mostly they're abstruse and often they change. They can be difficult to quantify. It's hard to figure out how you put odds on a policy change. Do you use a binary tree and assign odds at different nodes of a tree and take a joint cumulative probability at the bottom of the tree and say this is what I think the likely outcome is? Well, you played a number game with yourself. Congratulations. But have you actually predicted policy? Do you map flowcharts and look at the decision processes of the different entities and actors within an organized system? Or do you look at the interactions within an industrial sector and decide whether or not there's going to be a general tendency towards a policy one way or the other? Again, you have to make a lot of assumptions just to trying to anticipate policy. So it is for all the best reasons that organizations who model things make baseline assumptions about whether or not they're even going to treat policy change, because it can be very difficult to do well, and it often distorts more than it informs. So if you look back at history, we don't really talk so much about the policy changes per se, because economics and politics tend to constrain the policy decision. It's very often the case that a policy intervention occurs because there's some sort of economic or political energy situation that motivates it. And when it succeeds, those policy interventions succeed, well, then everybody talks about the economic result. Look at how much fracking is produced in the production of oil, and wow, look at the energy independence America has. Look at the efficiency gains in buildings in Central and Western Europe. Look at all the things that have happened. You know, the economic result is what matters. And when it doesn't work, the economic result is what matters. And that's what everybody talks about. So maybe at some level, we're not always focused on the policy. It's hard to model. It's hard to understand how it can change things. And when it does happen, it's hard to see. All those things can make it easy to leave it out, but leave it out at your peril. So I'm going to take you through three sort of vignette slides to contextualize discussion. And then I'm going to conclude with exactly one policy prediction with regard to the interval between 2018 and 2050, because I've got to be very clear. Our firm doesn't look that far ahead. We're myopic as hell compared to EIA. We can see about 2020 and only if we squint, but we do our very best to try to understand the intermediate future with relation to the distant future. And so I'm going to give you sort of three vignettes. Unfortunately, I said squint because our formatting is not usually for the big screen, and our flipbook format for portfolio managers usually involves them sort of lowering their glasses and squinting at us and then scowling at the page and squinting at us. These are sort of font-sized for squinting. I've divided three interventions, or three forces, into sine waves at 120-degree intervals. If only the world were so perfectly modeled. Supply, demand, and government cycles. Would it be so simple? But if you'll bear with me, in the blue, on the supply side, you end up with essentially low marginal cost producers expanding production, high marginal cost producers joining when the price rises, and technology answers the price, gains accelerate, the high marginal cost producers get driven out, low marginal cost production contracts, consolidation, and so it goes. We know the supply cycle when we see it. This tends to be more the case for oil than it is for other energy commodities, but that's largely because the history of oil has been longer and more dynamic in recent years than that of other energy commodities. On the demand side, I've simplified it. It contracts, it expands, and at some point, consumers make a decision, often, unfortunately, locking in low efficiency. When it seems like it's the best time to buy because energy prices are low, is often the time when the most optimistic purchasing behaviors happen. But government, what do they do first? This is perhaps U.S. specific in some cases. Usually they investigate when the prices are high. Who's responsible for this? But then there's incentives for alternative technologies. Efficiency and performance standards show up. And after a while, those incentives start to roll off because they're expensive. When the prices are lower, they're no longer as valid, politically speaking, as policies. Again, policies constrained by economics and politics. And then at some point, efficiency standards tend to lag or lapse. Can anyone think of any recent examples? I'm sure there are none. There are actually quite many, and they're not for the first time. Efficiency standards, vehicle efficiency standards, have come and gone in past cycles for the exact same reason. So one of the challenges of policy uncertainty is the cyclicality of policy with regard to the cyclicality of supply and demand. And no, unfortunately, it's not three equally dispersed sine waves, if only it were. Then, to talk about fuels demand specifically, the question is, what are you going to do? And in the realm of vast oversimplification, taken back from my pre-banking days in consulting life, there's nothing better than a 2x2 grid. You can sell these all year over and over again. Old cars, old fuels, new fuels. What are the policy options in each box? The brackets are policies, the non-brackets are technologies or essentially corporate innovation. And what you end up with is in the old box, you penalize the driver to essentially constrain demand. And that's how you address scarcity for transportation fuels, which for the most of our history on transportation fuels, the policy interventions have been about that. What climate intervention is really the same thing, but just in reverse, trying to eliminate hydrocarbon excess, yielding excess combustion, yielding excess greenhouse gas emissions relative to some baseline, and there's a lot of different baselines. But new fuels into old cars, well, we know how that works. The incumbent infrastructure is a very appealing thing to preserve, so why not find a new way to put in fuel, diversify, or decarbonize that way? And of course, that policy has been pursued. New cars that use old fuels or new fuels more efficiently. New cars policies, they come with a sort of troubling manufacturer-side resistance sometimes. Again, we're playing this out in real time in the US, so it's kind of fun to think about. But what about new fuels, new cars? That diagonal hop is really a big jump, right? You're talking about replacing incumbent transportation and fueling infrastructure and also coming in with new fuels entirely. Electrification of vehicles as a gradual process is a very different thing from the wholesale substitution of electrons for molecules. So I would commend that as these choices are being made, these different options are being made, there's also some natural crossplay and interplay between the policy choices that affect the end result in how economics maps out the policies on fuel demand. For example, in 2007, in response to high prices, the United States took the decision to go after new fuels in old cars, but also to go after new cars that used old fuels more efficiently. And so the two policies intersected. The fuel efficiency of the fleet improved, demand contracted, and the mandatory inclusion of ethanol into the gasoline pool exceeded the availability of the ability of the fleet to consume it. And you got something called a blend wall. So policies not only intersect, oscillate, but work at cross purposes. Boy, I'm not making this any easier. Well, then I have one last slide just to complicate things still further and set us on our way to discussion. Frank Verastro isn't here. He and I wrote a chapter in a book a few years back about how 2009 sort of represented the high point in climate legislative opportunity here and globally because it provided an intersection between natural scarcity and a desire to reduce emissions. Essentially, the world was running out of hydrocarbons and was trying to reduce emissions at the same time, and a carbon molecule emitted and a hydrocarbon saved could be linked to the same policies, or hydrocarbon not consumed, a carbon emission not emitted, that kind of thing. Scarcity and environmental values aligned. Interestingly, as the U.S. became more independent energy-wise, net imports reliance, energy security essentially improved as net imports fell. Gas substitution for coal reduced emissions, and there was a lucky confluence. But here's one of the challenges about policy. You may think that there's been something like 2 decades of perfect policy alignment with economics, just because there has. Turns out that scarcity aligned with environmental causes rather well, and then shifting fuels aligned with environmental benefits rather well. But they're not aligning so well anymore. Emissions are rising as net imports are falling. That scissoring apart of the trend lines is an economic conflict with what otherwise was already a difficult policy to enact. So, policy oscillates, policy intersects, and policy can be made difficult by economics. Wow, that was easy. So with all that, who would want to make any predictions at all? I will make only one. There was a discussion about the carbon intensity of the future in that first hour where Linda was taking us through the 2050 outlook. I think it's a safe bet that there could be a price on carbon here in the United States within a decade, even if Republicans are in power, and not because of climate, but because of commerce. And the reason is trade. It's a movement from not energy policy forward, but trade policy and climate policy intersecting trade war to carbon trade war. Essentially, as other countries that are reducing emissions under the Paris Agreement or otherwise take economic costs, they're going to want to protect their domestic markets with border adjustments. It's non-theoretical right now. You have Ursula von der Leyen talking about it, Emmanuel Macron saying there won't be trade deals without climate agreements. We're at the very cusp of this. The U.S. Congress may not be persuaded to save the world, but saving commerce is something they've done in the past. Europe sued over tax law in 2000 and again in 2002. In 2004, a 5% tariff rose 1% a month every month from March until October. In October, our manufactured goods producers and our lawmakers saw eye to eye, and the Congress changed tax law so that the U.S. could continue to sell into Europe. In short, commercial forces could also bring energy policy into play. Did I make anything easier about policy predictions? I did not, but full employment for everyone in the room. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. And next we're going to hear from Mac Lawrence, who is a director at Navigant and has thought a lot in his role as head of research about technology and innovation in energy. Thanks, Mac, for coming.
Thanks, Guy, and thanks to CSIS for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to be talking about the future as well, and in this case, talking about business models and how we see the market responding to all the changes that we've heard about this morning. And I'm going to talk at a high level in terms of the shifts that we see unfolding over the next several decades and what that means in terms of business models going forward. And like Kevin before me, I'm not going to make bold predictions here in terms of what the future business models will be, but we'll talk about some of the attributes of those business models going forward, at least as far as the discussions we have with clients going forward. So let me make sure I can advance slides here. Okay, so I'm just briefly with Navigant Consulting. We're a global management consulting firm. We operate in energy, healthcare, financial services, highly regulated industries. And we work with, in the energy space, we work with clients across the utility space primarily, as well as oil and gas, auto OEMs, retail, energy providers, high tech. So a nice cross-section of interest in terms of the energy space and how it's unfolding. And so we see quite a few perspectives intersecting in the space going forward. And of course, when we're predicting the future, as we've heard all morning, perspective is everything. And we won't always agree. We're going to read the tea leaves differently. There are two universal truths that I'll point to, and this is really gleaned from the day-to-day research that my team does, which is focused on emerging clean technology and how that's disrupting the energy space. Number one, I think it's safe to say that emerging technology is almost always overhyped. We get excited about new technology. We think about all the possibilities. We tend to focus on one application and run with it. Kind of Bitcoin is the classic example today in terms of the broader opportunity around blockchain. Number two, and contradicting the first point a little bit, but equally important, is the fact that when we forecast these technologies going forward, what we found with emerging technology specifically is that we're usually too conservative. The uptake of emerging technologies comes much faster than we can usually anticipate. So what does that mean in terms of looking forward into the future? And this is a little bit of a busy slide, but what we're showing here is essentially far off several decades down the line when we look at the forecasts compiled by Linda's team and others. What we can basically conclude is that the systems, the paradigms that we understand today are shifting rapidly. And what they ultimately will look like is why we're here discussing these trends. But what we can focus in on are these three drivers of change: technology, innovation, which I just talked about, customer demand, I'll mention today as well, and then we just heard about policy and regulatory shifts. And all of these obviously are fraught with uncertainty. So trying to make sense of this helps paint the picture of what the energy transformation looks like going forward over the next few decades. So at a high level, obviously, mega trends, we all know and have heard about these. But generally speaking, this energy transformation is really a story about demand decreasing or flat in the developed world, increasing in the developing world. It's an infrastructure challenge. How do we maintain existing infrastructure, make it smarter, more resilient? And then how do we build out new infrastructure to keep pace with demand in developing economies? And then, of course, integrating renewables and DER and access to those resources is a major problem and challenge going forward. So how does this play out? When we look at the power sector, we see this move away from a linear value chain, where we have centralized generation, a hub and spoke model, one-way power flow, to this two-way, highly networked, distributed grid. And the easy way to think about this, and this is a technology lens, but in terms of how this grid operates going forward in the next couple of decades, we see it increasingly cleaner. It's more distributed, more mobile. We're going to see EVs plugging into the network at different points. We already see that today. And then, of course, it's going to be far more intelligent. Same thing is playing out in the fuel space, and we've heard about that this morning, moving away from a linear supply chain to a much more diverse fuel portfolio, more fungibility, both with the power sector, but also within the liquid fuel space. And then the big one right now that everybody seems to get excited about is mobility. And this is really a question of the digitization of transportation, and what does that unlock in terms of potential going forward, both in the terms of fleets in cities, personal mobility, in terms of our autonomous vehicles and the scooters that we see all over the streets of any major city today. So to respond to this, we advise clients, you have to take a dual track approach. We can't shift the engine or switch the engine mid-flight. It's not practical. This is too big of an industry. It's too important. It's too embedded in everything that we do. So we have to be careful in how we make this transition to a different reality, a different paradigm. On the existing core business, it's important to free up capital and resources so we can invest going forward in new potential. On the new business model side, the future business side, which we see increasingly disrupting the status quo, it's iterating quickly on new products and services, deploying new business models, having an appetite for failure. These are all attributes that I would not credit the energy industry with broadly today, but it's certainly a culture shift that's going to need to happen to be able to deal with the rate of disruption that we see occurring. So turning to business model attributes, so I'm going to run through just a few examples here. It always starts with the customer, and this is probably one of the most cliche ideas out there today, but it's absolutely critical. And that's starting with the customer mindset, the customer expectation, which we see shifting significantly in the energy space, moving away from just in the power sector, moving away from just the expectation of safe, reliable, affordable power to an increased value attributes around sustainability, flexibility, the ability to change your demand profile, also being left alone, autonomy, as well as individualized products and services, which is always the trend in any major industry in terms of consumer products. And the challenge, of course, is how do we connect that to the innovative infrastructure and the emerging enabling technologies that are coming into the picture very rapidly and accelerating. And of course, the binding opportunity there is what are those business models and the values and the products and services that are going to deliver the value to customers. What are we hearing from customers today? We talked a little bit about it, so I won't reiterate some of those points, but we call this kind of the new 4 C's here in terms of choice, control, convenience, cost. And this is playing out across all customer Sustainability and resiliency are becoming mere table stakes in terms of the business proposition or the enterprise. We see this at the corporate level increasingly, and obviously there's a lot of discussion around that this week, both in New York and protests here. But essentially what we're seeing is a shift towards the de-risking the enterprise going forward, both in terms of having a seat at the table from a sustainability perspective and offering solutions that embrace those principles, but also in terms of resiliency. When you have more assets in the ground, like the energy industry, you're much more vulnerable, as we all know, to increasing physical threats as well as digital threats, cyber threats. Cities are really at the forefront in terms of rolling out sustainability initiatives. That's where all the action is, and that's only going to increase going forward as we see the urban population continue to accelerate through the next several decades. And of course, from an individual citizen perspective, millennials are going to be the workforce and hopefully in jobs over the next couple decades, and they're overwhelmingly in support of sustainability initiatives. When we asked utilities, what do you perceive to be your greatest threat? Where there was no question about it, rapidly increasing renewables and distributed resources were cited as the #1 threat to their existing business model. Embracing decarbonization, which kind of goes hand in hand with the sustainability question, is absolutely critical in terms of business models. How do you value the services around decarbonization initiatives, embracing sustainable development goals? And then, in parallel with this, we're seeing this massive increase in the global clean energy economy, growing at over 40% CAGR over the last decade. So this market is developing very rapidly, going back to the original point I made. From a business model perspective, in the energy industry, of course, we've thrived on the idea of economies of scale. That's what this industry has been built on over the last couple centuries. And we're moving away from that. We're moving to a world where we have far more distributed resources, as I mentioned. These are increasing significantly. You can see over the next 10 years, we see new DER capacity, distributed energy resources, solar, EV charging, microgrids, storage, increasing at 8 times centralized generation. So that's a massive shift taking place as we speak today. And so in order to get back to scale, we advise that business models really take into account the reality of these resources and look for aggregation plays that can roll up a portfolio of these resources, even though they all behave differently and have different value attributes. Try to find a package that resonates with customers. In terms of the value pools going forward, again, keeping with the theme of this shift towards a decentralized grid, we're seeing a significant downstream shift away from generation in terms of value in the energy industry, or in the power industry, to the end consumer and around retail. And this is a massive opportunity, and energy companies are not alone in going after this, of course. We're seeing the entry of oil and gas into the power sectors at a significant scale, increased over the last decade. Everything from tech companies to telcos to security companies, consumer manufacturers are all investing heavily in that customer relationship, and they're very good at it. Unlike, I would argue, many utilities, which claim they have customer focused initiatives, but have a long way to go in terms of matching the ability of many of these companies to deliver products that consumers want. I've got a 2x2 grid, as every consultant should, I guess. But here we're talking about the evolution of business models, and there's a study that came out of the Kellogg School several years ago that mapped business models across the Fortune 100 and categorized these based on these 4 categories. And what we see in the energy industry is mostly on the left side, asset builders and service providers. And then if you compare that with the green box, this so-called network orchestrator, these are essentially companies that leverage digital technologies, don't own any assets, and the Ubers, the Airbnbs out there have proven, as we've all seen in the news, to be highly profitable and much more scalable in terms of businesses. Whether they'll be successful long time, of course, is in the long run is yet to be seen. But we have yet to see a true network orchestrator in the energy industry emerge today. There's obviously many challenges to getting to that place. But the bottom line here is we see the margins on assets decreasing substantially over time. So being in a large centralized generation business is just going to be far more risky going forward. We look, in terms of business model innovation, looking for value stream diversification. This is no longer about commodities, but around the value of data and financial flows two-way. Consumers becoming prosumers and participating in the market. How do you access those value streams? We look for platforms, and this is, again, probably the second most cliche term in the business world today. But in this case, when we talk about platforms, what essentially we're talking about is areas of confluence of demand, of technology democratization, compounding innovation. Where do we see, breakthrough innovations bouncing off of each other and creating yet new innovations? And then industry coupling opportunities where we can cross-leverage capabilities and services to drive sustainability goals and what have you. And I'll wrap up here. Running with the platform idea and looking out in the future in terms of where the opportunities are. We've identified 7 energy cloud platforms, we call them, in the energy space, where those 4 attributes that I just mentioned are playing out. Smart cities is probably one of the best examples. Obviously a very, very difficult nut to crack, but we have a number of different players from different industries competing essentially for similar types of services. IoT is one example. Mobility is another. So how these opportunities play out, really relates back to the policy trends that we talked about earlier, technology innovation and customer demand. I think that the best pathway forward is to follow the infrastructure turnover. And again, this is going to be at a smaller scale than what we've seen in the past, but we can see those infrastructure trends on the left here. We have a significant hill to climb, not just from a climate sustainability standpoint, but just in terms of keeping pace with the infrastructure needed to support economic growth going forward, as you can see in the UN stat on the right here. So I'll stop there. Look forward to answering any questions and the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. Now we're going to hear from Grzegorz Peszko. He's one of the leading economists analyzing climate change issues at the World Bank, as well as it has extensively published in leading journals on that subject. Thank you, Grzegorz.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having invited me here. And I have to make general disclaimer that nothing what I'm going to say represents the views of the World Bank. They're my own. Especially that I'm going to talk about what probably everybody is, thinking here. I'm going to talk about the future. And it's increasingly easy to talk about the future in these days because the future becomes more and more unpredictable. And while there's this kind of wide range of possible futures, any projection basically is right, because we cannot really determine the probability distribution, which becomes so flat, and the fat tails of the possible futures become so fat that we can unleash our creativity. So in order to kind of tame this creativity a little bit, we need to really be careful and really think about the drivers of the future. And it was very, the discussion today very much centered about which drivers are related to kind of autonomous forces of technologies and markets, and which drivers are related to more subjective forces of policies. The choices that people are going to make that are not yet made, including by the people who have not yet been born. So in our thinking about the future, we can try to understand the market and technology autonomous drivers, which Mark have alluded to many of them already, which which are associated with a certain kind of pattern of megatrends that this way or another are related to what we call a low carbon transition. It's a transition, deep structural transition of the way we run our economies, we think about our consumption and production patterns. And this transition is becoming driven or perceived as more urgent because the climate change is, manifesting itself in a way that we don't like, and it's becoming more and more real. So all these disruptive energy technologies in power sector, in transport, less in industry, digitalization, dematerialization of the economies, all the networks and infrastructures that are being developed that kind of lock these new technologies, new business models are emerging, that kind of question all our thinking about the future being a linear extrapolation of the past, and the notion of anything like business as usual is becoming quite blurry. Now, this thinking about business as usual is usually related to projections that are based on very few variables that were quite good predictors in the past. And the main one is what is in this orange part, which is the level of activity in the global and national economies. So, yeah, the economic growth used to be a very good predictor of all sorts of drivers of energy consumption, energy production, especially that we can assume that a lot of developing countries are going to catch up with the level of income that we have in in OECD countries. So this urbanization, as well as the growing aspirations of the global middle class, especially in Asia and very soon in Africa, is expected to often to drive the energy consumption and production patterns, because we believe, or if we believe, that basically an average Asian and African middle class consumer will have similar behavioral patterns, similar habits as we have in US or in Europe. But that's part of this, landscape of uncertainty. What will be the future, consumers and investors' preferences? And that links to policies, because policies are not completely independent from autonomous technological and market drivers. They are made easier by, these autonomous changes, but they also drive these changes. And we've heard about a few kind of types of policies here. It's about climate and environmentally driven policies, but it's also about the whole kind of mission-oriented innovation and all the realization of countries like China, for instance, that their future role in a global economy can no longer rely on export-driven heavy manufacturing, due to the low labor costs, but they have to really jump towards the technology frontier and reinvent themselves in the global economy, which has huge implications on the future patterns of energy use in China and similar countries. We heard about border adjustment taxes. It's another kind of type of policy instrument that looked completely wild 5 years ago as a kind of heresy among economists, but it becomes a kind of mainstream conversation at the moment. Among not only economists, but politicians. I mean, if you have seen the letter that the new European head of the EU sent to the Trade Commissioner, she just bluntly said, you shall develop the EU policy on border adjustment taxes related to carbon emissions. So we have this landscape of uncertain drivers. So if you try to turn these drivers into projections, the range of possible futures become apparent. Yeah? So these are projections based on not on the World Bank these are not our World Bank projections. We just collected the available projections from the International Energy Agency, as well as from the main oil majors. So these are industry projections about the future oil demand under the alternative assumptions of what this autonomous technology market and policy trends will bring. So you can see that already in 2030, that the difference between the kind of orange lines, which represent kind of an extension of current policies, business as usual type of notions, or the kind of reference scenario as we have heard today from EIA, they assume kind of uninterrupted growth of oil demand by 2040, but all the kind of greenish scenarios, they assume that the world will change, that both the consumer preferences and investor preferences and technology trends and policy trends will align with what natural scientists tell us is necessary to stabilize Earth climate at around 2 degrees higher than during pre-industrial times. Okay, so these are a range of possible futures, and you can see that already when 2030, the level of uncertainty equals more or less 1/3 of the global demand for that period. And if we extend this graph to 2050, the level of uncertainty would be around 100% of the global oil demand, because all the climatic models tell us that in order to stabilize climate at around 2 degrees, in 2050, we need to have zero net global greenhouse gas emissions. That means that we still can have some consumption of oil, gas, and coal. We can still burn some fossil fuels, but only if we have massive negative emissions in terms of storage of carbon in biological systems or in the geological formations. So I'm not here to judge which projection is right or wrong, and that's not the point of making the projections. And I think that's the kind of the message that I'd like to convey here, is that it's very useful to have reference or baseline or kind of current policy scenarios, but it's not very useful to stop there. That's why the International Energy Agency, Shell, Exxon, they are all running alternative scenarios about the future. Because when the future becomes so unpredictable, it's of paramount importance to be prepared for alternative scenarios, for the best case scenarios and the worst case scenarios. Because as Pascal used to say, the fortune favors prepared mind. Now, some of these policy trends that we are talking about may look quite feeble at the moment. Here is our annual monitoring of carbon prices around the world, and although we see carbon pricing that it's explicit carbon pricing through carbon taxes or emissions trading systems, we can see them increasing year from year. Nonetheless, still only 15% of the global CO2 emissions are covered by any sort of explicit carbon prices. Only 1% of the total CO2 emissions globally is priced at the level that is compatible with the 2-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And these are mainly, emission taxes in Sweden, in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Finland, France, and Norway. But majority of the emissions are still, either untaxed or covered with a very low carbon taxes. Now, if we look at the implicit pricing of carbon through energy taxes, this is our colleagues from OECD are doing very interesting work on this. We can see that, again, there are some perverse incentives embedded in the current energy taxation from the point of view of alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is that although liquid fuels in transport are taxed, in terms of carbon content, are taxed quite heavily, the carbon content in coal goes untaxed by and large around the world, and natural gas is also taxed at a very low level, the carbon content in natural gas, but paradoxically higher than coal. So can we say, okay, by looking at the current policies, current trends, we can, have a single projection that they will continue until, 30 years from now? So I think we need to be ready for surprises and need to be ready for sudden twists and turns in the business as usual case. And I wouldn't maybe bet everything on the kind of angry kid factor that we see on the streets now around the world, because these angry kids are mainly white, European, or American for the time being. But there are there are trends that that clearly suggest that the world is shifting, and if the EU is likely to announce in New York their commitment to the carbon neutrality by 2050, that would make your graph about the Europe being, second largest place for the demand for liquid fuels in 2050 kind of irrelevant. Yeah, if the Europe achieves a climate neutrality target, and referring to what you said, I mean. Yes, it's based on the new policies, but when EU commits to new policies, there are enforcement instruments in place to make sure that they are achieved. At least so far, Europe has been consistently overshooting its emission reduction targets. I mean, I'd like to conclude with something that I think is very important going forward, which is, what about the countries and industries that rely on fossil fuels? What it means for them. And we are just going to soon publish a book, which we wrote about it, which look at what the low carbon transition can mean for these fossil fuel dependent countries, because many of them, unlike US, are relying primarily on fossil fuels as their source of revenues, on heavy industry as their source of kind of non-rent profits. So that's, how do we manage this transition as a global community is very important. And how do we create the space for the fossil fuel dependent countries to participate in all these mega trends in a way that is not threatening to them, that does not undermine their development and growth potential, that allows them that diversification strategies that move them from not only beyond oil and gas, but also beyond all the heavy manufacturing that is emission intensive and hence exposed to the border adjustment taxes. And how can we use international cooperative mechanism under the Paris Agreement to align the self-interest of producers and consumers of energy within and across countries to sail and navigate these mega trends of low carbon transition in a way that will not create havoc for our children. And that's the message that I'd like to leave you with at the beginning, at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we have plenty of time for this panel Q&A session. So I'll take the advantage of being moderator to ask a couple to get started while you're thinking about your own questions. Kevin, I know you spend, as you said, a lot of time thinking about very short-term issues, the nature of your business. One of the most recent short-term issues has involved the massive attack on Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia. And I'm hearing from the advocates of domestic, mainly oil, saying, see, this shows us why we need to step up our investment in infrastructure so that we could produce more from the Permian Basin, take away more natural gas capacity, export more natural gas, produce more natural gas. On the other hand, the advocates of a quick transition away from fossil fuels say, I've told you so. We can't depend on these unreliable suppliers. The risk is too great. How do you think that's going to play out in policy decisions or policy changes over the next? I know the election probably has more to do with it than that event, but just in your experience, how do you think it's going to play out?
So as a catalyst for policy, an economic shock is a powerful thing. We did not have what I would characterize as an economic shock, certainly not one that would stand out in anything other than percentage terms. For average end users, pretty much everywhere in the world, it was where the price was a couple months before in the rear view. So that does not by itself catalyze policy. But I think you're right to point out how it can be used by the people who want to make policy decisions. And there, to your list of not only those who would advocate for a transition on this basis, look at the vulnerability of existing infrastructure, those who would argue for more production in the U.S., but also those who would look at strategic government reserves. And I think Senator Murkowski, Chairman Murkowski of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, for example, said, well, maybe we should look at not selling off strategic resources. The way I would describe the broader environment is that everything changed on September 14th. If you thought that you were going to go back to what you were doing as an oil analyst before that day, forget it. Your life is now different. So if you had plans that you thought you were going to get to after this, you're not. You're going to be doing this for the rest of your life. This is different. On the other hand, the interventions from policy alternatives are also going to get a lot stronger. And I think that if you were looking at what EV advocates were waiting for, they were probably waiting for a moment that could offer some argument that would make the case other than 1%ers driving second cars 1/3 as much. And so that, that's really, I think, going to come up a lot in our political process. And to the extent that it results in a polarity shift in Washington and a polarity shift in other countries, I think it could be contextually useful. But it was not an economic input to a policy choice.
Thank you. Mac, in one of your slides, you mentioned one of the stress-producing issues for especially investor-owned utilities, is the requirements to meet mainly state renewable fuel standards. How are your Navigant's electric utility clients coping with that stress-producing policy?
Yeah, no, I think the response generally follows two pathways, and I would say most, I can't say all investor-owned utilities, but many, realize that they have to play a defensive game, obviously, and that's been, the case, I would say, over the last decade or two, as solar and other initiatives have kind of come into the I guess the resource picture. Many utilities have fought very hard to kind of protect the status quo because that's a substantial shift away from the way the market is set up. So I don't think they're wrong per se or anything like that, but they're grappling with that reality and what it means in terms of just the assumptions that undergird the industry today. On the other path, they're playing a much more offensive game more of late than I would say, say 5 years ago. And I think more and more of the investor-owned utilities, I would say munis and co-ops are a little further out in front, and just because they have a little more flexibility and they have a tighter relationship with their constituencies or their customers. But the IOUs are certainly starting to embrace now the reality, and I think trying to understand how they can integrate some of these renewable plays more proactively. And that looks more like the old business than necessarily something new right now. So, looking at community solar programs and things like that where they can, kind of own the assets and look to aggregate right away.
Thanks, Mac. Gregos, I know you were speaking mainly from your personal experience and in your work, but the work at the World Bank with respect to climate change mitigation. Can you speak to some of the current policies and work that's being done in your job at the World Bank?
Yeah, so I mean, the World Bank, remains committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement and works with its client countries to both to adapt to the climate change that is occurring, as well as to work with them on aligning their long-term development objectives with the goals of the Paris Agreement on the climate mitigation side. We are driven by demand. We are owned by shareholders who are governments, and we are driven by the demand of our client countries. So we cannot go to a country and say, oh, you shall decarbonize because we want it, because then they go to another bank for borrowing or in other places for advice. But I think we usually find a strong development case for low carbon kind of development of the energy sector, especially the type of most of our investments in the energy portfolio are renewables at the moment. There's increasing kind of pressure to look at the transmission, distribution, smart grids as the way to enable larger and faster penetration of variable renewables in the grids that are in developing countries often are poorly managed and poorly designed. They are not really the constraints that you were talking about large-scale integration of variable renewables in the grids in developing countries are much higher than in Europe or US. We've just, yesterday, I think there was an announcement that there was a big trust fund established to facilitate storage, energy storage, and again, adding new flexibility resources in the grid. So I think our countries see that in order to be competitive in the future, they need to go beyond the industries of the past and beyond the ways of doing business that prevailed so far, whether it's energy, industry, or transport. So I don't want to go into details because it will be boring for many of you, but I think that the trend that we see is very clear, and the countries are looking forward into the future that they believe is going to be different than the trends observed in the recent past.
Thank you. Let me stand up. Room as well, and so everybody could see my EIA tie. I just want to make sure, once EIA, always EIA, guys. I'll open the floor for questions. Kevin and Mac and Gregos. Yes, sir.
This question is...
your name and affiliation before you.
My name is Joe. I go to George Washington University. This question is for Mr. Pesco. You mentioned that carbon tax disproportionately penalized liquid fuels and not power-generating ones like coal and natural gas. Why is that?
Well, first of all, I didn't say penalize. Well, carbon tax is not a penalty. Carbon price is a fee for service. Is a payment for a real cost that fossil fuels impose on the actors in the economy, whether they are present agents or the future agents. So it's not a penalty. It's a fee. It's a compensation for the damage that emissions related to the combustion of fossil fuels cause. Yeah, why the rates of implicit carbon taxes on liquid fuels are higher than on coal and gas? It's quite easy to explain. I mean, first of all, these are not explicit carbon taxes that I was talking about. These are carbon content embedded in the energy taxes. And liquid fuels are a very good base for energy taxation because, it's easy to control them. They are inputs to final consumption by and large in transport, so they don't create a lot of distortions in the economy. So they are just good candidate for an energy tax. The real trouble is why coal enjoys such a low tax rates. And that's this distortive policy, which you can say that, in several countries, the excise duties on energy products are waived, or for coal, they have, zero tax rate. And from the fiscal point of view, it's a tax subsidy, it's a tax expenditure. So, this is part of these policy reforms, and that is still ahead of us in most of the countries, although the differences are varied. And if you look at the tax rates on liquid fuels in US, it's a few times lower than in Europe. And you can see that over a few generations, it led to a completely different patterns of urbanization, completely different patterns of transport networks. So going forward, if we want to have a policy-induced change of urbanization and transport and energy networks, we will have to think about aligning energy taxation with the full social costs that different energy products impose on society.
Bill?
Yeah, Bill Eichort, consultant. Kevin, in your remarks, you talked about energy efficiency measures, and by what you were saying, I'm sort of extrapolating that maybe you're talking about transportation efficiency measures, but of them finding their way into trade agreements as opposed to the, in light of the current regulatory changes that are occurring in the United States. So I'm just sort of wondering, could you talk a little bit about more about that and what you think the implications would be in terms of the time to implementation of the actual efficiency, as opposed to when there's a change of policy going on domestically?
Sure, thanks, Bill. I think I talked separately about efficiency standards coming and going, and to that topic, I spoke not only about transportation efficiency standards, but also stationary efficiency standards, which have also recently come and gone, and historically come and gone. As far as the extent to which that factors into trade, the interface of a carbon price adjusted at the border maps through an entire economy. So the efficiency with which one produces a good from a fossil fuel source as an energy input to that good's production is going to affect the way that good trades into a regulated economy on the other side of an ocean or border somewhere. The latency with which efficiency standards improve incumbent capital stock means that if that were going to be your main compliance mechanism, if your goal were to sell into Europe, which is regulated by an explicit price that could soon broaden and externalize, and you were hoping that efficiency standards would be your mitigating compliance mechanism to eliminate your tax burden crossing the border with goods into Europe, you'd have to wait a long time. So there's different kinds of standards that are much faster, more prescriptive standards that eliminate things or phase them down quickly. But efficiency standards tend to be very slow in propagating when you have long-lived capital stock. Where they've not been slow, when you have short-lived capital stock, like light bulbs. That happened fast.
Any others? I guess we have room. Yes.
Just a quick follow-up to that. So on the trade, I'm sorry, I have a loud voice. So on the trade adjustment policy, your prediction was that that would be the source of even a country resistant to putting carbon prices on being forced to do it. What do you see as the alignment of interest of the various countries? How are all the countries that are putting these policies in place going to kind of create a common interest coalition that would result in that in a place that's been resistant to it like ours?
Let me be clear and brief. recognizing our time limits as well. One of my fellow panelists pointed out that there was a time when talking about this was a sin. It was an ungraceful, warlike way to put a price on carbon. There were talks about GATT Article 20, sub B and sub G, for environmental exceptions to normal trade. But actually, the mechanism in discussion now is using national treatment and applying to imports what you would apply to yourselves when you have a carbon price in place. The alignment is horrible. There's no actual alignment. It equilibrates at a very bureaucratic level the same way the rest of trade does, a harmonized tariff schedule full of carbon attributes. That mechanism exists today in other ways. Duties are assigned and lifted, assessed by the border controllers of different countries. And there are WTO mechanisms by which this can be done more or less gracefully, but there's nothing graceful about it. Safe to say that the era of a top-down global carbon price and the global federalism that went with it died in 2009.
Gregors? I'm just gonna quickly add to it. Russia has decided to ratify Paris Agreement, and the main industrial lobby of Russia, which is Union of Industrialist Entrepreneurs, have been fiercely against it. They were convinced by the threat of the border adjustment taxes. I mean, if you look at their statement, which supports the ratification of the Paris Agreement, it says bluntly, we believe that the Western countries can use Russia non-participation in the Paris Agreement as another pretext to increase tariffs on our goods and services. So, I mean, countries take it seriously.
Well, we have to time for our next panel, and I don't want to take any more of their time. So please join me in thanking Kevin, Mac, and Gregors. Thank you, guys.
Okay, excuse me. We're going to go ahead and get started with the final panel of this morning's presentation. The benefit of going last is we can say whatever we want about the two previous panels, and no one will follow us to challenge us. So I think it was quite fitting that the end of the previous panel essentially ended on trade and some of the uncertainties and challenges of how the trade system might evolve to take into account carbon. And so this discussion is about trade more broadly, but I think that conversation is something we should sort of come back to. And the openness of the trade regime is obviously something that is under question, under threat. And so I would love to get into that conversation as well as we talk about the shifting patterns in energy trade. So our panelists today, immediately to my left is Jamie Webster, who is at the Boston Consulting Group Center for Energy Impact. Previously to that, I was at IHS, where I worked with Jamie back in the day. Next, after Jamie, will be Leslie Palti Guzman, who's the co-founder of Gas Vista with a long career in energy consulting at a number of places like the Rapidan Group and Eurasia Group, as well as the Columbia Center. And then in between them is Anna Mikulska, who is a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute and at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at Penn. So we have a wonderful panel, diverse perspectives on this topic. So we're going to kick it off with Jamie to talk about sort of the geopolitics on oil and offer some of the reactions to what we've heard so far, and then we'll go to Leslie and then Anna.
Thank you, Nikos. So as mentioned, I'm Jamie Webster with the Boston Center for Boston Consulting Group, and I'm also a fellow at Columbia University Center on Energy Impact. Let me see, Ian just showed me. So I wanted to talk today a little bit on some of the shifting patterns we're seeing in energy trade focused on oil and geopolitics. Nikos and I were just looking at my slides earlier, and we both remarked that I am, despite being with one of the best consulting firms in the world, I have neglected to do a 2x2 in my presentation, and I have now, as Nikos pointed out, started with the very basics, just giving you a sense of where prices have been, because I'm sure none of you are aware of that. I do want to talk a little bit. We just, a couple of weeks ago, we actually just hit the 5-year mark where the Brent prices have been below $100 since that point. And to me, it is, so I did some work for some clients kind of trying to talk through kind of the differences that have occurred in these last 5 years. And it's absolutely stunning. And I think the most recent and germane geopolitical / disruption event is really, of course, the Abqaiq attack. To me, it was really informative to see just how much of a disruption we could handle. And while Saudi Arabia is doing a great job with bringing the production back quite quickly, it was amazing how tepid the price response really was. And this is at a time when the U.S. has implemented policies that has largely cut off Iran from international oil markets. Venezuela's production is also very low, exports of around 100 to 200,000 barrels a day. And this is quite a turnaround from back in 2008 when we were waiting on bated breath for every 100,000 barrels a day of oil up or down from Nigeria as we were trying to figure out how we were going to handle this. Some of the other things that you've seen in terms of the changes from a geopolitical standpoint is certainly from OPEC, which has really recognized some of the change in what has occurred. I was at the Thanksgiving 2014 OPEC meeting when OPEC decided we're not going to cut production. We want to give what was termed a good sweating to the industry and really bring production down. Obviously, they had shale in their sights, but they had Canada in their sights and Brazil and a lot of other countries that had brought on a lot of production during those periods of high $100 plus prices. And so prices dropped, but production really did not fall off too terribly much. And a couple of years later, because they really started to feel a lot of pressure, a lot of these petrostates started to feel a great deal of pressure, even as U.S. production, while it fell, it didn't really fall. It took about 6 months before we even started to see a slowdown there. So they changed strategy, and the strategy really suggests just how much more dynamic the oil market is. The strategy was not just a shift and say, okay, we're actually going to cut production, but also a recognition that they could not do it on their own, and they needed to bring in additional partners. And while these additional partners, Russia being the one that is most well known, they haven't joined OPEC officially. OPEC really depends on them to be able to carry out this policy. Shale, in the meantime, has really allowed the U.S. to become, and I'll talk about that in a bit, both a big producer but also a huge exporter, giving a lot of competitive advantage and being able to negotiate with the U.S. and other suppliers as countries try to decide where they're going to get their crude from. The Administrator Capuano kind of put out the IEO this morning, and I know the central case has a assumption of about $100 by 2050, with the top line case of up to $185 and a bottom of $45. The EIA always has a very wide band, which a lot of times people kind of get after them about it, but I actually would say it's a very uncertain market, and when you're talking about that far, it's good to have a really wide band. It really does suggest that uncertainty that we have out there. Personally, I think that actually we're probably going to be more on the lower side. We have learned that the shale industry has educated the rest of the industry in being able to bring on production much faster at much lower cost. And you've also got those concerns about peak demand that were talked about in the other panel and other places. And so there's really a potential where we could have much lower prices, which of course will make it a bit more difficult in terms of dealing with reducing carbon emissions, but will also give a real benefit for those countries that are growing quite rapidly. And we do see, the administrator talked a bit about demand this morning. I remember in 2013 when the FT put out an article saying that non-OECD demand is now above OECD demand. But not stated there was some of the implications for that. And those implications are, one, those are countries that are still dealing with a lot of pollution and still trying to figure out how to manage that. It also meant that the great EIA data that I and lots of people depend on here was becoming less and less useful as you looked at the weekly production stats and supply stats, as you started to get a greater sense of trying to understand what was going on in the rest of the world. And I think this is one of the drivers behind the IEA's recognition that they needed to extend their reach beyond their traditional members and really get a better understanding of what is going to be happening. It also meant that for a lot of the producers, there really started to be a very big focus on Asia. So you saw several years ago as Saudi Aramco for the first time had its board meeting in Beijing, trading up from Houston, where they had it many times in the past. You're also seeing a shift in the sort of types of demand. Part of this is as these countries grow, so the first few years it's about diesel and building these new cities, and now you're starting to get into lighter and lighter fuels, and of course this is also assisted by some policies such as the IMO's policy that will be enacted in January 1, where we're going to go from 3.5% sulfur down to 0.5% sulfur. BCG has done a lot of work on it, and the Center for Global Energy Policy up at Columbia has also done a lot of work on that. But the interesting thing is also that trade is actually becoming a much more important element. Trade is actually growing, and this is, when I define trade here, this is oil that is passing over a country border or a regional border, and you're seeing actually that is accelerating beyond the fairly strong demand growth that we've seen over the last couple of years. Now, obviously, part of this is driven by the U.S., but it's also driven by the Middle East, which makes up about 25% of it. Russia and Russia exports is another part of it. Even China has been, of course, exporting more and more petroleum product. And so this move towards trade is an interesting one to watch, in that the fact is that the oil market, which has always been a international and globalized market, is actually becoming more globalized. We're having more and more movement of oil around the world, and you could certainly see that when days after the Abqaiq strike, the price for booking a tanker for the U.S. went up more than 10%, almost overnight, as a recognition was had that they were probably going to be called on to provide some additional oil. But you're also seeing a bit of a skew as well. So I've already talked about how that acceleration of the trade has grown. And so as it says, in the year 2000, about 60% of oil and products crossed a border. We're now at 72%. And so we are becoming more and more globalized. And so you're getting a lot more ability for countries to decide what they're going to do, but it also means that for the U.S. and any other country that has the power to do it, that sanctions and the ability to levy sanctions can impact that country, but has less and less of an impact on the global market. This is different than in 2012 when we were at a slightly tighter market when we implemented the sanctions on Iran, and prices went as high as $120. And so that flexibility is certainly there. The other interesting change that we're seeing is that it is not even between crude export growth and product export growth. You're now seeing a much faster growth in product exports. And while product exports is still around 10 million barrels a day less than it is for crude exports, if the numbers keep going in those directions, within 10 years, they're probably going to pull even with one another. What this means is that previously, the mode was you take the crude oil from the producing area, whether that was the U.S. or the Middle East or Russia, and you would transport it to the local area where they would then refine it into the products that they needed. Instead, what you're seeing is a bringing the refineries back to home. You first saw this with the first sort of business model of this, which was the Jamnagar refinery and others in India, where they would bring crude from other places and then export that products around the world, recognizing that if they had a big enough refinery, they could actually make that work. You're also seeing a big boom in product exports out of the U.S. Certainly, we've grown a lot in crude exports since the policies changed, but our product exports are also booming. You're also seeing a big boom in product exports out of China and the Middle East. And so what this means is that for countries that previously wanted to build up refineries for energy security reasons as well as for economic reasons, there's likely to be, particularly as I look at some of the results that came out of the IEO this morning, there's likely to be an overbuild in refinery capacity, particularly in Asia. And so that dynamic of trying to understand where that's going to, where those products are going to be refined and where they're going to be sent out. But as you start to build out this additional capacity, which may end up underutilized, this is actually going to increase a bit of energy security as these countries have the ability to bring in crude and products from a greater variety of countries from around the world. Unlike Kevin, I wait until the end to tell you that I don't know what I'm talking about and don't listen to me. Anyway, I appreciate it and looking forward to the other comments.
Thank you, Jamie. Leslie, you're up.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me, CSIS. I'm very happy to be here. I was in Houston until this weekend. I attended the gas conference, so I'm full of fresh insight and good pulse on the industry. All the attendees got very wet also because of the storms, but we eventually made it back home. So I'll focus my remarks today on 4 forces that I think are shifting trade patterns in the global gas trade. And at Gas Vista, we're combining gas analysis, global gas analysis, and we're also a technology provider, and that's our bread and butter. We're combining policy, geopolitics, market fundamentals, with a good layer of data analytics to predict what will happen. So first, cost matters. The most promising LNG markets and the largest growing market right now is Asia, and many countries in Asia are price sensitive. Many of them will request and are already requesting competitive supply. So we're anticipating that many of those buyers will prefer suppliers that are very close geographically. Proximity will be important because it will reduce transportation costs. In today's market also, we are in a very abundant gas market with a lot of supply. That will likely continue for a while, but it means also that we shouldn't take for granted the Asian price premium. So those two trends means that we're likely to see, maybe not as anticipated by many, a growth of inter-regional trade, but instead a refocus on intra-regional trade, meaning that the US LNG may remain in the Atlantic basin, while Pacific suppliers will remain in the Pacific. We've seen that illustrated by swap deals. So there is a growing trend of swap deals for US LNG. What it means is that many of the off-takers of US LNG, some of them have been Asian off-takers. They don't want necessarily to bring back the LNG back home because it's too expensive. So they found trade partners that have other regasification capacity or other end users that they can swap the gas with in another basin. And that is actually creating a whole new range of trade shift and trade patterns. Second big force is that trade deals and trade politics matters. And what I mean by that is that trade is not solely driven by economics. We discussed earlier politics, and I add to that, in this current administration, we saw the use of LNG as a tool and a leverage in trade negotiation and trade discussions. And that has been the case with essentially every single partners, US trade partners. And that is reconfiguring also many of the trade patterns that we see for US LNG, but not just. If you take the example of the US-China trade war, it is impacting first and foremost the US-China trade, but also actually redirecting trade flow between other non-US suppliers and and other buyers. So we see that the conflict, those trade wars are also accelerating final investment decision in other jurisdictions, in other countries. And that's crucial because where investment decisions are going to be taken, whether it's on the regasification side or on the liquefaction side, will in the future influence trade flows. So since the beginning of the trade war, we've seen that there has been 3 major final investment decisions being taken outside the US, one in Canada, one in Mozambique, and one in Russia. And those are going to be major growth in future supply and bringing additional trade flows. So before this investment decision, Canada's west coast was not yet on the map to provide LNG to Asia. Now it is. The jury, I think, is still out on whether those trade wars and trade negotiations are harming or not US LNG. It's too soon to tell, because on some regards, some of the Asian partners of the US have been very receptive to those trade renegotiations and are actually buying more US LNG or have signed new LNG contracts. However, in the medium term, even if it benefits rival suppliers from the US, in the longer term, it can impact everybody because of lower growth of LNG trade or slower economic growth. Third big force is geopolitics. So geopolitics matters, and by this I mean that as Asia is growing as a big consumer of natural gas, they will also prefer supply diversification and diversification of trade routes too. And the fact that we're currently in an oversupplied market and the fact that supply will continue to be abundant means also that those buyers have an unusual level of influence to direct the growth of supply and where this growth of supply will come from. And for instance, interestingly, the trade route that was the most used in 2018 was the Japan-Australia trade route. So Japan is the largest LNG buyer, but Australia was the second largest LNG supplier. And it's not the Qatar-Japan route that was the most used. We talked earlier about the Strait of Hormuz disruption, and I think in the future, that will also impact geopolitics, and those geopolitical risks will increasingly impact decisions making for where is the next big supplier coming from, and whether we want more expansion and more growth of supply from the MENA region. Historically, Asian buyers have been very anxious about geopolitical risk in the Middle East, and that has not changed, especially in light of today's geopolitics in the region. So I'm anticipating even more increased diversification of supply route and encouragement from those emerging Asian buyers to support supply growth outside traditional trade routes and traditional suppliers. That brings to the earlier point mentioning that non-OECD growth of supply for gas is also growing. Fourth, environmental consideration matters. On one hand, those Asian countries are increasingly taking seriously their problem with air pollution, especially in big cities. Some of them are more ready to pay a health premium for their gas. And I think that we don't see it yet in Asia, but eventually end consumers may dictate how clean they want their energy mix and how clean they want their gas. So we discussed it also earlier regarding Europe, and I think that's the future of trade also, that will be dictated by what kind or how clean the end consumers want their gas or their LNG supply. So those four forces, market forces, politics and trade economics, geopolitics, and environmental, are part of the puzzles to predict where US LNG flow will go. Back in 2015, I wrote correctly that US LNG will be exported 1/3 in Asia, 1/3 in Europe, and 1/3 in the rest of the world. That's happening now in 2019. But I've always said also that US LNG flows will be highly unpredictable in terms of destination, depending on seasons, depending on demand, and now increasingly more depending on politics and trade economics. So, I think that we have only 3 years of history of US LNG trade flows, and those 3 years have been widely different. For instance, at the beginning, when the US started exporting, MENA has never been like a large chunk, but was an interesting niche market. Well, now it has been very reduced because Egypt has becoming an exporter again because of large domestic supply and reserves that have been developed recently. Jordan also has reduced imports, and that's an important consideration is that the trade of LNG is also competing with this kind of gas on gas, pipeline gas, but also domestic supply. South Korea is the largest importer right now of US LNG, and that will likely continue. That has grown since the renegotiation of the Corus agreement. And that's something to keep in mind also when we think about other deals that are being renegotiated right now. And finally, in terms of infrastructure and investment and financing is also key. The US government is currently leading the way with the Indo-Pacific strategy, Asia Edge, and its Asian allies to start spearheading infrastructure financing in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And at GasTech last week, there was an announcement between a US gas developer that develops a new export project and Vietnam. And I think we're increasingly going to see more of those deals in Southeast Asia and South Asia, which is one of the fastest growing niche market in Asia. So with that, I would like to leave you with a few thoughts. At Gas Vista, we like to challenge the consensus, but only when there is a consensus to challenge. But I think we shouldn't take for granted the fact that interregional trade will continue to grow. And also, on one hand, we see two opposing forces. On one hand, we see that the market is becoming more liquid, it's easier to trade, it's more accessible to less credit-worthy market. But at the same time, there is an ever-evolving role for governments and increased politizations of trade flow. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. My level of confusion is rising progressively as this panel goes through, which I think speaks to the complexity of talking about trade, so I appreciate that. Anna.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I have the amazing advantage of speaking the last and having heard everything else, and I have the amazing disadvantage of speaking last and having heard already everybody. And that was actually one of the reasons why I haven't prepared slides, and I'm hoping to kind of, that what I say responds in many ways in what has been said before, and also to the EIA projections in a way. So the world is currently at this dual challenge between the population growth, economic development, need to access energy reliably and affordably, especially in the developing world, but also, on the other hand, this issue of climate change that has been recognized, has been increasingly a point of concern, and has increasingly affected energy environment. Investment is going to be here at the center of this kind of trying to agree those two often competing issues. Much of the challenge, but also the success of this challenge will depend on the investment. And the fact that we have not only this duality of issues, but also duality between the different types of countries, between the developed and developing world, and the duality of needs will also be very important. So we've talked here about this misalignment between energy resources with the supplies and also where the energy resources are needed currently. And as the EIA Outlook pointed out, Asia is the place that we will see increasingly more and more resources flowing, because that's where the point of demand is going to be, the growth of demand is going to be. And investment is also going to follow that, particularly the investment that will help trade to grow and bring those resources that are available in currently Middle East, but also increasingly in the developed world, like the US or Australia, to the developing world, and places like, of course, China and India that we've talked about, or non-OECD Asia, as the EIA, again, Outlook has pointed out repeatedly. That's going to be very important. So trade is there. We need to develop it. We know that, and investment will be crucial for that. So where this investment is going to take place, how quickly it's going to be taking place, what type of investment is going to be very important. So we'll see investment growing, and we have seen this specifically in the US. On the supply side, we see investment in the supply, growing outputs in oil and gas, but also midstream is extremely important, and export infrastructure is extremely important. And we've seen development in LNGs, and that happens in the US, but of course not only. Australia is a big force here, is Qatar, and recently increasingly Russia. And as Leslie has mentioned here, we've seen this just recently for the investment decision on Novatek's LNG Arctic development, the second part of it, which I don't think it's a response to increasing difficulties with trade between the US and China, since this has been in the making for a while, but it will increasingly be a part of the world. Russia will be increasingly part of the world where China is actually reaching for resources. So There's going to be also some development in Africa and Latin America, and the growth will be large there. But because it's a small base, we won't see it, and we won't focus on this growth for the several next decades. So we'll see infrastructure buildup that's going to be including pipelines, LNG terminals, export-import terminals, refineries, petrochemical complexes. All this is going to facilitate trade. But how fast this investment is going to proceed, it also will determine whether or not we will be developing as fast, or both developing in terms of developing world, whether the world will be developing as fast as we hope and in the direction that we hope. Types of, just a second. So the goal basically is to have energy supply that's affordable, reliable. And we often have to talked about how important different aspects are, and that we also respond to uncertainties. And investment very much nowadays already responds to those uncertainties. So in a way, we will see investment as different because we have these uncertainties about policy, as we've mentioned many times here before, and also technology. So any technological breakthrough that will come that we cannot possibly predict may completely change the game. And this also goes for policies. Policies, especially coming from large countries like the US and China, may completely change the game, if not for long term, then at least for the shorter term. But it will impact investment, and we'll see that investors think about it. These policies can and will include increasingly climate issues. And we see that investors and investments are also thought through to include those issues going forward. We see that investments are better managed in a way that is less costly increasingly. They also often smaller or divided in smaller portions. So hopefully the cost is smaller, and also going forward, we are not locking in too much. If for some reason technology will provide different environment, or policy will make the trade environment potentially different. Also, I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned enough is that in many ways, energy security is becoming very important for the developing world. And trade, again, is often a cornerstone of that, and trade policies are. So increasingly more difficult relationships on the basis of less friendly trade policies may create this kind of need or push in the developing world, not only to rely on trade to bring in resources, but also to make sure that the resources are available, or at least some of those resources are available domestically, or at the very least regionally. And this could potentially bring in more investment in renewables, more investment in nuclear, but also it can bring, and I think in many ways it already does, bring more investment in coal. When you think about it, coal is an interesting resource in a way that it's actually much more widely distributed than oil and gas, and it actually is quite available in Asia, in countries in Europe, and so on. And therefore, countries not only will look at the economics, which still for coal is good, not only will look for the policy trends, especially international policy trends, but they also will look whether they're able to actually provide some energy security for themselves without relying on other countries. Lastly, there is an issue, political issue, and I think that's as a political scientist, I feel like I have to mention that. There is different ways in the way countries will react depending on whether they are autocracies or democracies. So we won't see, for example, and it depends what kind of resources they, of course, have. And being Polish, again, I can put here this example where in Poland, coal is quite popular in a way that actually provides 80% of electricity. And it's very hard to get rid of it, despite EU pushing for getting rid of it. In fact, I think Poland, recently President Macron has lambasted Poland for not helping EU getting to the zero carbon neutrality or the carbon neutrality level. But it's more, so in Poland, it's the idea of energy security, making sure that they're not only reliable on Russian gas, for example, but also it's the idea of elections. Coal provides jobs. These are often, in developing countries, there's a lot of labor, and a lot of laborers will actually be helpful in fueling the industry. But later on, it's very difficult politically, especially in democracy, to get rid of something that provides jobs. In Poland, these jobs are actually, and oftentimes they actually in one place. So in Poland, the region that is responsible for hard coal development provides approximately 100 seats in 460-seat government, parliament. This is an issue for any type of elections and party that runs in those elections. They will look at it, and especially that in that region, the elections are usually very close. Well, the parties will respond, and that's why it's so difficult. So it's not only whether or not options for trade exist. It's not only whether or not you're looking at energy security, but also political options are very, very important. And I hope we can talk about it maybe in the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to kick off the conversation picking on a theme that all of you talked about in one way or another. And I wanted to sort of get your thoughts. I wanted to bring us back to the easy task of thinking about 2050. All this present stuff is, 2050 is fun, right? And that one of the tensions that you highlighted specifically, you, Jamie, and Leslie, you both kind of like made a bigger deal in your presentations, was this simultaneous move towards more trade, but also more friction. And it seems that so far we're at the point where the sort of trade is winning, that the friction isn't big enough to sort of break down the system, that you have some readjustment of flows, some people are maybe sending their gas somewhere else. But as we play out, I mean, is that going to continue to be the case, or what do you think might be the barriers to sort of tip that balance where you just erect enough friction that you start breaking down that sort of smooth functioning system? Or is it that we're so in on this globally traded system for energy that, the system will always find a way around it? Jamie, maybe we start with you.
Well, if we're talking out to 2050, these are, of course, future facts rather than forecasts. I would say that the one thing that you can see is probably a move towards more regionalism. So as you've got, because part of the reason why we're seeing so much trade in, at least in oil, is countries have too much, and so they're ready to trade, and so they, the U.S. is also still importing a large amount of crude and products. And so you could start to see, a move towards regionalism, where it's, the U.S. has effectively done this with, if you asked if an Iranian was here, the smooth flowing trade, they would say, what are you talking about? It's not smooth flowing at all. And I think you might see that sort of move of regionalism, where if you're spoiled for choice on where you can get your crude or products, then, you will naturally, as people have naturally moved away from Iran, or some countries have talked about, moving away from the U.S. for crude or products. So you'll see like a move towards that. But it's also a question on, what is the role of oil going to be when you get out to 2050? Are we actually going to start moving not just towards regionalism, but also will electrification be, that much higher? Right now it's only 4% of transport. And so if you start to move to where, pretty much everything is electrified, then the role of oil starts to shift as well.
That's my next question for you, so I'm glad you stopped right there. Leslie?
So I think governments are both injecting friction, but also are trying to help with the free flow of gas and bringing more transparency. So it's finding like the right balance between, you know, what kind of intervention and level of intervention, and also whether you're sitting in the US or you're sitting in Russia, you have also a different perspective on the role of governments in trade flows. So I think, you know, it's in the coming years, it's going to be very interesting to see how successful is a government, like if we take the example of the US, in trying to facilitate investment decision, financial aid, matchmaking between buyers and sellers, and trying to in a way, direct trade flows to help with the exports of US LNG in the case of gas. In other jurisdictions, you see governments that are becoming very anxious about decarbonization, and governments that derive a lot of their resources and budget from those fuels want to make sure they are not going to be stranded. So they are also helping their national champion or their companies to develop those resources on time. And that will create also a lot of geopolitics around stranded gas. I mean, we're definitely going to see a lot of frictions, but in terms of a few signs of optimism in the area of trade, when it comes to LNG, we see increasingly more like a greater commoditization of the fuel with new instruments to trade, including new pricing, like futures indexes and derivatives, new electronic platforms, and all that makes the trade easier to access for smaller players. And we've seen for now a couple of years a greater diversification of the players, and that, you know, the more players there are, the less monopolistic situation there are, and the better it is for the free flow of molecules. So it's both sides, yeah.
Anna, do you want to add anything? Or?
I think in many ways a lot have changed when the US and Australia, developed countries, democracies entered the market. The dealings are different. Governments do support specific energy outputs and supply and so on, and that's what you would, I guess, expect. The nice thing about these countries entering is that they don't enter as suppliers, they only support suppliers, and it's at the end a commercial decision whether or not enter to an agreement, whether or not send gas or oil somewhere, which is based on economics rather than government decision that's directly geopolitically oriented. And in that way, and more governments entering, specifically democracies, based on trade and economic principles, are creating more energy security in the market.
Jamie, I wanted to come back to you. There was a little bit of a discussion in the first panel on the liquids outlook and whether or not the continuous increase in liquids consumption is something that we would see. And I wanted to get sort of your thoughts on that. Obviously, you know, peak oil demand has been something that has made the rounds the last few years. Kind of like, where do we stand, and where do you stand in your thinking on that topic?
So peak demand, you're right, it's been talked about for a number of years. And I guess it really matters of like, okay, so why do we care about peak demand, or what does peak demand mean? And so I look at it from a couple of different points, because if you kind of look at the history of peak demand, the world peaked on a per capita consumption in 1973. The U.S. peaked in jet kero demand some years ago. You've had, there's a whole list of peak demands that we've already hit. There was a thought that the U.S. hit peak gasoline demand last decade. Turns out that wasn't actually true. So the question is, okay, well, why do we care about peak demand? And from what the way I kind of look at it is, the companies care about it because in 2018, oil and gas companies was the worst sector to invest in. And in 2017, it was the second worst sector to invest in, with mining being the worst investing. So if you're looking at a low price environment, which is kind of my long-term sort of view, and if you look at the IEO this morning, you can make that interpretation as well. And so if you don't have prices, going up, and so you don't have price and you don't have any additional demand, for an oil and gas company, it's kind of a sad story. It means you need to look for something else, or at least, or start to compete much more aggressively to try to go after market share. So it matters there. The other place where it could matter is, this is about the climate. And so obviously if we have peak demand, that is a good thing in that means we aren't putting an additional increment every year. But if we go up to 103 or 105 million barrels a day, and then we peak there and then slowly, move down to 100 million barrels a day, over the next 10 years, that's not super exciting for the climate, and you've still got to deal with, the decline rates and all of that. To me, the interesting thing on peak demand would be if and when, which I actually think is underrated in its potential for it to happen, which is effectively the proverbial, horse demand curve. And so, with current technologies, no, you don't see that happening. And there is this debate. You participated in this debate with one of your papers as well. Is it going to be a fast transition, or is it going to be a slow transition? And I actually think there's a lot of potential. Historically, the transitions have been slow, but also historically, they haven't actually been real transitions, as has been pointed out by several people. It's really just been percentage went from this fuel to this fuel, but total demand actually continued to rise. This is a different sort of transition that we need to handle the climate, the emissions problem, which is that we actually need not just a transition away, but we actually need demand to start to come down, at least from the emitting fuels. And so that's where it matters. But I did a consultant thing, kind of dodged your question. So my view is actually you're likely to see peak demand, in the next couple of decades. It's very tough to kind of say what that is. And also you really have to pay attention on what it actually means. And is this a permanent peak demand? And what does that curve look like after you hit, that day?
It's okay to dodge my question if you say a nice thing about something I wrote. So that's a pretty basic rule, so you're fine. Leslie, I wanted to come to you. One of the things you talked about was the price sensitivity of Asian consumers. And in particular, just looking at this outlook, how much of the demand is really about non-OECD, it's about Asia, it's even about Africa. But then you kind of, as you put price sensitivity up top and you made us get very concerned, by the end you said, well, eventually people might be willing to pay a premium for environmental cleanliness and the environmental benefits that gas brings. So I was wondering if you could sort of walk us through how you think that playing out, and whether or not there is any risk of sort of gas, the premium for gas sort of coming too late, that by the time people are willing to pay for that, maybe they have other options, or how do you think about that price sensitivity of gas and the ability to sort of be part of this really remarkable growth story in the non-OECD?
So let me start with today, because it's easier. So we see that countries such as India, China, are very price sensitive in the sense that they import more spot LNG, for instance, when prices are in the affordable range, like around $5, $6 per million BTU, or obviously they will take lower too. And they are also the first one to renegotiate their contracts when they can. They don't like the big difference that they see right now between oil-indexed contracts and cheaper gas-indexed LNG, for instance. And they are driving some changes also in the way LNG is going to be priced in the future. So there are ongoing negotiations between exporters and importers on how to price the future of LNG contracts for new projects, for instance. And we see a move away from oil indexation and increased creativity and diversity around the formulas in contracts, including the use of hub-based pricing, like TTF for Europe or JKM in Asia. And I think that trend illustrates the willingness first not to see the Asian premium come back, and also the willingness to have gas, for now, part of the fuel mix, as long as it's competitive with their other fuels. So most of the countries in Asia are using a lot of coal. If gas is to increasingly displace more coal, it has to remain affordable, and that, I think, on the supplier side, I think they understood this now, and also for the survival of the LNG industry, Asia being the largest promising market, they have to be competitive and affordable in this region. So yes, I think cost matters a lot, but at the same time we cannot only look at this. So I mentioned a lot less creditworthy emerging buyers, because when you look at the next wave of first-time importers of LNG, actually, interestingly, it's not concentrated in one region. It's not concentrated. I mean, it's global. And very varied. So, it goes from Bahrain soon, potentially Saudi Arabia, to Vietnam, the Philippines, Myanmar, a few new entrants also in the southern Europe, like Croatia, and then the Caribbeans. But those countries, will enter the market with additional help. And, including, I didn't mention Africa, but like Ivory Coast, Ghana, Benin, those countries will need help for their infrastructure development and potentially to guarantee also the purchase of those fuels. So that's where governments are important to facilitate the trade and to make it more competitive. So I think the notion of competitiveness also is not just based on economics, but includes, a lot of things behind, including, diversification of supply and infrastructure, like with developing and financing the infrastructure.
And I wanted to, you're one of the few people that you spent the most talking about coal. And I wanted, one of the more provocative things that Administrator Capuano put up in the morning was sort of the resurgence of coal, essentially in the latter part of the forecast period. And we had a good discussion in the morning about what assumptions kind of drove that. But you made sort of a little bit of a pitch for the stickiness of coal. And so I wanted to sort of get your reaction to that sort of long-term forecast.
So I talked about coal because I have written something about coal relatively recently, and I actually have started collecting data and trying to look at why coal sticks in certain regions and why it doesn't in others. And it's mostly the developing world where it sticks because of economics, and also because of people's readiness to kind of change and get different jobs and so on. So there's this issue of whether you can afford it and whether or not you have the resource, or whether you have an alternative resource that can replace that coal cheaply. So we've seen this in the US. It's really the market has driven coal out and brought more natural gas. In Europe, we see the policy working and then the ability of wealthy societies to afford more expensive electricity, more expensive fuel in general. But then there is this developing world, and if they have enough gas, they will run on that gas, for example, or if they will have enough renewables or so on. But when they have coal, they will stick to it because it's economics, and also, as I said, is energy security. So in many ways, we have to look at all these options and think how, if we really want to get to the climate goals or generally, environmental goals, what can we do? Because in a way, it kind of looks very depressing, and that not much can be done, even though we are talking on a very high level, and also in lower levels in many societies, but especially the developed world societies, right? So we have generally wealthy people and generally wealthy societies talking about adapting to climate change, but this, the reality is often different in the developing world. What I have seen recently, though, it's been this kind of move to this realization also in the developed world. So when you see actually the outlooks, the IEA outlooks and so on, and BP outlook going forward, you actually see that there's this acknowledgement that it's not enough to push in renewables. You have to do something about that carbon that we will emit globally because of the development that's happening in the developing world. So there has been a bigger push to look into how to store carbon, CCS, and different type of technologies that can afford it. And I think that's where we really kind of need to think, how can we incorporate our experience, but also how can we make sure that the experience of others is also incorporated, and in a way that means R&D cannot only happen in the developed world. It has to happen in the developing world, which generally doesn't have the resources. So maybe the developed world role is to kind of increase the resources for R&D, bring in scientists, allow the scientists to work there, and so on. So there's a lot of issues that could be resolved somewhat differently, but incorporating the needs of the developing world. And again, it's really, when we think about climate change, the issue is not fossil fuels, it's the emissions. So when we think about the solutions, when you look at emissions, there are different types of solutions. The renewables are a huge deal. But if we don't look at the whole range, we might be missing something. And I think the point is not to miss something because of the challenges, particularly in the developing world, Asia, but also increasingly Africa and of course Latin America, and we want to make sure that we just don't kind of close ourselves in our small world and then at the end kind of be faced with a very different reality than we were thinking we're going to face.
Excellent, thank you. We have about time for a few questions, so I'll open it up to you. The rules the same as the previous panels. 1, wait for the mic. 2, please state your name and affiliation. 3, question in the form of a question, and I always give bonus points for brevity. So, any takers?
You guys mentioned, I'm Peter Volkmar, I'm from TD International. You mentioned an increase in regional trade happening, and we've seen some very large pipelines going from Russia into Europe. How much do you see large regional pipeline infrastructures being developed in India and Central Asia and helping going around LNG imports and instead doing regional gas pipelines?
So that's a good question because we haven't talked much about pipeline trade. I think, pipeline trade in some regions becomes kind of a dinosaur compared to the LNG trade, which is much more flexible and easier in many ways because you don't depend on one supplier or on one customer. However, you mentioned Russia to China, Russia to Europe. It gives to both markets a lot of security of supply, but at a high cost. On the geopolitical level and other levels too. I think we'll have to take region by region, but the East Med, for example, is an area where we're going to see growth of pipeline trade potentially at the expense of LNG imports. This region may export at one point also LNG, but it's interesting because a few years ago nobody was thinking about this, and reserves and discovery happens. I think in Southeast Asia, the trade for pipeline from Iran is much more complicated for political and geopolitical reasons. So those big paramount efforts to build large pipeline infrastructure, I think for me are something from the past, and if they take too much time to be built, that won't happen. I was mentioning ISMED before. There is a pipeline under discussion to bring this gas to Europe, but I think, again, those are remote options that will take too much time to be built, too politically complicated, too costly too. So I think you need to look at the cost also. When LNG can be more affordable and quicker to access and easier to access, that would be the preferred trade. And I think long-term projections, many analysts see the LNG trade becoming bigger than the pipeline trade.
Thanks. Jean-François Boitin with MEDEF, French Business. I have a question to Leslie about this theory of intra-regionalization versus inter. Would you say that the current tendency of the administration to mix trade and strategic considerations is actually a handicap for trade, because it would not be very wise for a number of countries, I'm thinking in particular of China, to be too dependent on long-term contracts of natural gas, because it's a wonderful blackmail tool?
I believe that the use of LNG as a tool in negotiations can work, and sometimes it can harm also. So it's a double-edged sword, and it depends who is the recipient. I think for European trade partners of the US, it was less successful in a way, and much more successful with some Asian partners. But the story is not over. There are many renegotiations of deals right now. There is, I think, a thinking that, for the US, it might be better not to be too dependent on one single market, so it's better to diversify destination early on while the US is ramping up its exports. So I think that's what you meant by not being too dependent on China. But at the same time, it's hard now to build new U.S. projects without relying at all on the Chinese market. So the U.S. LNG exporters are being deprived right now from one large market, but they have put in place mitigation strategies. One is like remaining very competitive, and two, trying beyond China to find other markets. I don't know if I answer your question. On the US? Or? Well, China right now has a choice. Since we're in a very well-supplied market, China has a choice between its suppliers and can actually, pit one against the other. So, most of the consumers right now are in the driving seats right now.
Well, I think that about wraps up our marathon session. So thank you to our panelists, thank you to everyone in the room, and thank you to everyone online for watching this great session.